Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The smell hit me before I even saw him. Wet wool and forest decay, like something dragged up from beneath decades of rotting leaves. I was unloading groceries from my truck when that familiar scent drifted across the gravel drive, and I knew, with the kind of certainty that settles in your bones, that he'd been here again. My property sits 40 acres deep in Pennsylvania timber country, surrounded by state game lands that stretch for miles in every direction. The nearest neighbor lives 3 miles down a dirt road that becomes impassable after heavy rain. I bought this place for the isolation, for the silence that only exists when you're truly alone. But lately, I've come to understand that silence can hold things you'd rather not hear. I saw him crossing from my shed to the main house. Tall, deliberate, with that peculiar rolling gait I'd noticed before. Hooded sweatshirt pulled up despite the autumn warmth. Camouflage pants tucked into boots that left prints too large for any man I knew. He moved like someone who belonged here more than I did. Someone whose feet had memorized every root and stone long before I'd ever set eyes on this land. The grocery bags grew heavy in my arms as I watched him reach my front door. He didn't knock, didn't hesitate, just pushed it open. I must have forgotten to lock it again, and disappeared inside my own house like smoke drawn through a crack. My hands trembled as I set the groceries on the truck bed. The rational part of my brain screamed to call the police, to drive away, to do anything but follow him inside. But there was another voice, quieter and more insistent, that wondered if calling the police would only confirm what I'd started to suspect, that I was losing my mind out here in the woods. The door stood ajar, exactly as he'd left it. Inside, my house exhaled cold air that shouldn't have existed on a September afternoon. I stepped across the threshold, and the floorboards groaned their familiar welcome. But underneath that sound was something else, a rhythmic creaking from upstairs, like someone shifting their weight from foot to foot. The muddy boot prints started at the door, each one perfectly formed, showing the deep tread of hunting boots. They tracked across my hardwood floor, past the kitchen, toward the stairs. But they stopped abruptly at the edge of my grandmother's Persian rug, as if whoever made them had simply ceased to exist at that precise spot. No smudges, no partial prints, nothing to indicate where he'd gone from there. A heavy thump echoed from my bedroom directly above. I climbed the stairs, each step an act of will against every instinct telling me to run. The hallway stretched longer than it should have, the afternoon light through the windows taking on a greenish, underwater quality. My bedroom door was closed. I never close it. Living alone makes such privacy pointless. When I pushed it open, the room was empty, but the air held that same wet wool smell, and my bed showed the clear impression of someone having sat on its edge. The window was locked from the inside. The closet held only my clothes. Yet I could feel it. That sensation of having just missed something, like walking into a room moments after someone else had left, their presence still disturbing the air. I told myself it was a drifter, maybe someone who'd been squatting in the woods and gotten confused. These things happen in rural areas. But when I mentioned it to old man Wheeler at the gas station the next week, his face went pale beneath his Phillies cap. He told me about the game warden then, speaking in the low voice people reserve for ghost stories and local tragedies. Happened in '78, he said. The warden had been doing his rounds, checking deer stands and hunting licenses, when he simply vanished. They found his truck parked on what would later become my property, keys still in the ignition, door hanging open. Search parties combed the woods for weeks. Dogs lost his scent near what's now my shed. Never found a body, never found an explanation. The man had walked into the forest and become part of it. But here's what Wheeler said that really got under my skin, the words that started turning my isolated paradise into something else. The warden had lived in my house. Before it was mine, before it belonged to the family I'd bought it from, it had been his. He'd raised his family there, walked those same halls, slept in that same bedroom where I now lay awake listening to sounds that shouldn't exist. That night, I deadbolted every door and checked every window twice. I even dragged my grandmother's heavy oak dresser in front of my bedroom door, a precaution that seemed both necessary and absurd. But when I woke the next morning, my hunting jacket was gone from its hook by the back door. I found it 3 days later, hanging inside the shed, still damp with morning dew and smelling of pine sap and something else, something animal and old. The pockets held things that weren't mine, a handful of acorns, still green, a compass that pointed somewhere other than north, a hunting license from 1978 with the photo torn away. I started keeping a journal, documenting each incident, trying to find patterns or explanations that made sense. The appearances followed no schedule I could determine. Sometimes weeks would pass in perfect solitude, and I'd almost convince myself I'd imagined it all. Then I'd come home to find my back door standing open, fresh mud tracked to that same spot where the prints always ended, and that smell, God, that smell, lingering in rooms I hadn't entered in days. The worst part wasn't the intrusions themselves. It was the waiting, the constant vigilance. I'd catch myself checking locks obsessively, peering out windows at shadows that might be trees or might be something else. I installed cameras, but they showed nothing, just empty rooms and static during the times I was certain someone had been inside. Either technology failed in the face of whatever visited my home, or my mind was manufacturing elaborate delusions. Sleep became elusive. I'd lie in bed listening to the house settle, parsing every creak and pop for signs of intrusion. Sometimes I'd hear footsteps in the hallway, slow, measured, like someone trying not to wake me. When I'd gather the courage to look, the hallway would be empty, but the air would be cold and thick with that forest smell. One night in November, I woke to find my bedroom door open despite the dresser I'd pushed against it. The massive piece of furniture had been moved aside so carefully that I hadn't heard a sound. Snow had started falling outside, and in the moonlight, I could see fresh boot prints on my bedroom floor. Prints that started at the doorway and led to the foot of my bed, where they stopped. Just stopped. As if someone had stood there, watching me sleep, before simply ceasing to be. I didn't sleep for 3 days after that. The locals started avoiding me. I could see it in their faces at the grocery store, the way conversations died when I approached. Whatever was happening at my place, whether real or imagined, had marked me as someone to be wary of. Maybe they thought the isolation had gotten to me. Maybe they knew something they wouldn't say. By December, I'd developed a kind of routine with my visitor. I'd leave the doors unlocked. He'd get in anyway, and I was tired of replacing broken locks. I'd find my jacket moved, sometimes worn, always returned damp. The muddy prints appeared and vanished. Things from outside would appear inside. Pine cones arranged on my kitchen table, frost patterns on windows that shouldn't exist, leaves scattered across my living room floor in deliberate patterns I couldn't decode. Then came the night I saw him clearly. I'd been reading in my study, fighting off sleep with strong coffee and the complete works of Thoreau, seeking some wisdom about solitary life in the woods. The grandfather clock in the hallway had just struck midnight when I heard the front door open. By now, I knew better than to investigate immediately. I waited, listening to those familiar footsteps cross my floor, stop at that same damn spot. But this time, they continued. Up the stairs, that rolling gait unmistakable even through carpet and wood, down the hall toward my study. I set down my book, my hand surprisingly steady, and waited. The door opened slowly, and there he stood in the doorway, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing that hooded sweatshirt and camo pants I'd seen before. But when he pushed back his hood, I saw why the locals had gone pale, why the cameras showed nothing, why the prints always ended at the same spot. His face was my face. Older, weathered by decades of outdoor life, but unmistakably mine. The same crooked nose I'd broken in high school, the same scar above the left eyebrow, the same green eyes that stared back at me from my bathroom mirror each morning. He looked at me with an expression of profound sadness, or maybe recognition, or maybe both. He spoke then, and his voice was mine too, just rougher. as if he'd been shouting into the wind for 40 years. "You're living in my house." I wanted to argue, to show him the deed, the mortgage papers, all the legal proof that this place was mine. But looking at him, at myself, I understood that ownership meant something different here. Something that had nothing to do with papers or banks or the exchange of money. "I've been walking these woods since '78, he continued, moving into my study with that same rolling gait. "Checking the deer stands, watching for poachers, making my rounds. Can't seem to stop. Don't remember why I started, just know I can't stop." He sat in the chair across from mine, the leather creaking under his weight, real weight, not the weight of imagination or hallucination. Up close, I could see the mud on his boots, smell the decades of forest decomposition in his clothes. His hands were scarred from briar scratches that would never heal. "Are you me?" I asked, though the question made no logical sense. "Am I you?" He smiled then, an expression both familiar and foreign. "Does it matter? You came here for the isolation, didn't you? To be alone? Well, you got what you wanted. You're so alone that you're becoming your own ghost." I thought about the months since I'd moved here, how I'd gradually stopped answering my phone, stopped checking emails, stopped driving to town except for absolute necessities, how the paths through the woods had become more familiar than any human face, how I'd started wearing that damn hunting jacket every day, even inside, because it felt right somehow. "The house doesn't want to be empty," he said, standing with obvious effort. "Never has, never will. It needs someone walking these halls, checking these windows, maintaining the boundary between the forest and the civilized world. I did it for 40 years. Now it's your turn." He moved toward the door, and I found myself standing too, following him without conscious decision. We walked down the stairs together, our footsteps synchronizing into a single sound. At the Persian rug, my grandmother's rug, or his grandmother's, or nobody's, he stopped. "This is where I stop existing," he said matter-of-factly. "Every time, can't figure out why. Maybe because she loved this rug, wouldn't let me track mud on it. Habits die harder than men, I guess." I looked down at the rug, its intricate patterns seeming to shift in the dim light. When I looked up, he was gone. Not vanished dramatically, not faded like movie ghosts do, just gone, as if he'd never been there at all. But I could feel it, the weight of his presence, his purpose, settling onto my shoulders like that damp hunting jacket. I still live here, still walk these halls. The groceries get delivered now. I don't go to town anymore. Too many questions in their eyes, too much fear of what I might be becoming, or what I've already become. Sometimes I catch glimpses of myself in windows, and I'm not sure which version I'm seeing. The man who moved here seeking solitude, or the one who's been walking these woods since 1978. My reflection wears clothes I don't remember putting on, shows scars I don't remember getting. The journal I've been keeping shows entries in handwriting that's almost mine, but not quite, describing patrols through the forest, checking things that don't exist anymore, maintaining boundaries that might never have existed at all. Yesterday's entry, which I don't remember writing, says, "New owner moving in soon. Should introduce myself." I've started leaving the doors unlocked, started taking long walks at dusk, my feet finding paths I've never walked but somehow know. The hunting jacket fits perfectly now, like it was always mine, or like I was always its. There's someone new looking at the property, the realtor told me on the phone last week. Funny thing is, I don't remember listing it for sale, but the papers are all there, signed in handwriting that's almost mine but not quite. The closing date is next month. I should probably warn them about the muddy footprints, about the jacket that moves on its own, about the tall man with the rolling gait who walks from the shed to the house on September afternoons. But I have a feeling they'll figure it out for themselves. After all, the house doesn't want to be empty. Never has. Never will. Story 2. The rain in New Orleans that October afternoon fell like hot grease, thick and suffocating, despite the cold front that had rolled in from the Gulf. I'd been wandering the French Quarter for hours, my tourist map dissolving into pulp in my pocket, when the downpour drove me through the nearest doorway. A narrow entrance squeezed between a voodoo shop and a shuttered cafe on Dauphine Street. The sign above read, Curiosité Perdues in faded gold lettering, though I could have sworn it said something else when I first glanced up through the rain. The door stuck at first, then gave way with a sound like breaking suction, and I stumbled inside trailing water across warped floorboards. The heat hit me immediately, not the humid warmth of Louisiana, but something dry and pulsing that rose through my shoes, like I'd stepped onto a giant radiator. Yet the air itself was arctic, raising goosebumps along my arms, making my breath visible in small, desperate clouds. The contradiction made my equilibrium shift, as if the shop existed in two temperatures simultaneously, neither willing to yield. I stood there dripping, letting my eyes adjust to the amber gloom. The space was deeper than the narrow storefront suggested, stretching back through corridors of stacked furniture, mannequins in moth-eaten Victorian dress, and glass cases filled with objects I couldn't quite identify in the dim light. Candles burned on every surface, hundreds of them, their flames unnaturally still despite the cold air that should have made them flicker. The smell was what really unsettled me. Beneath the expected mustiness lurked something medicinal and sweet, like formaldehyde mixed with burnt sugar. It coated the back of my throat with each breath. I took a step forward, and the floor responded with a pulse of heat that traveled up through my legs. Another step, another pulse, rhythmic, almost like a heartbeat. The rational part of my brain suggested old heating pipes, maybe some quirk of the building's ancient infrastructure. But the pattern was too organic, too deliberately timed with my movements. That's when I saw her. She sat behind a counter at the far end of the shop, so still I'd mistaken her for another mannequin at first. Her skin had that papery quality of extreme age, pulled tight over bird-like bones. But it was her eyes that made me stop. Clouded white like spoiled milk, no iris or pupil visible. Yet somehow I knew she was looking directly at me. Her lips moved, and though she was 30 feet away and spoke barely above a whisper, I heard my name clearly. My full name, middle name included. The one I never used, the one that appeared only on my birth certificate and passport locked in my hotel safe. The floor pulsed harder, heat climbing up my spine like fingers. I wanted to ask how she knew my name, wanted to demand an explanation, but my throat had constricted to a pinhole. She tilted her head, listening to something I couldn't hear, then nodded as if in agreement. "You're expected downstairs," she said in that impossible whisper that filled the shop. I managed to force out words, though they came out cracked and strange. "There's no downstairs. This is the French Quarter. Everything's at sea level." She smiled then, revealing teeth too white, too perfect for someone her age. Not down, beneath. The shop breathes through many mouths. The heat through my shoes intensified, and I became aware of a sound, a deep, rhythmic whooshing like bellows working far below. The candle flames began to lean toward the floor, as if pulled by some invisible current. I backed toward the door, but my feet felt heavy, the soles of my shoes sticking slightly with each step as if the floor had become tacky. The old woman never moved, just watched with those blind eyes as I fumbled for the door handle. "The invitation stands," she called out. "The heat knows you now." I yanked the door open and stumbled into the rain, gasping as the cold water hit my face. But even as I ran down Dauphine Street, splashing through puddles, I could feel it, that alien heat still pulsing through my shoes with each step, as if I was still walking on that impossible floor. Back at my hotel, I peeled off my shoes to find the soles warped and discolored, the rubber bearing strange marks like they'd been pressed against a hot grill. The pattern wasn't random. It looked almost like writing, symbols that hurt to look at directly. My feet themselves were unmarked, though they tingled with phantom heat for hours afterward. I tried to forget about it, told myself it was some elaborate tourist trap, maybe pipes under the floor and a lucky guess about my name. Hotels do lose passenger information after all. But that night, lying in my climate-controlled room 20 floors above the street, I felt it again. That rhythmic pulsing heat coming up through the mattress, through the floor. through 20 stories of concrete and steel. The next morning, I found myself standing outside the shop again. I hadn't meant to go there. I'd planned to visit the garden district, but my feet had carried me back to Dauphine Street as if following a memorized path. The storefront was different in daylight, narrower somehow, the windows soap-blind with age. Through the glass, I could see the candles still burning, could see her still sitting there, waiting. I didn't go in, not that day, but I started noticing things. Every floor I walked on afterward carried a trace of that heat, just beneath the surface. Carpets, tile, hardwood, it didn't matter. The pulse was always there, faint but insistent, like something massive breathing far below. Coffee shops, restaurants, even the St. Louis Cathedral. Everywhere I went in the quarter, I could feel it. On my last night in New Orleans, I couldn't sleep. The heat had become unbearable, rising through the hotel mattress in waves. My mouth was desert dry despite drinking glass after glass of water. At 3 a.m. I gave up and walked back to Dauphine Street, barefoot this time, my feet burning with each step on the cold pavement. The shop was open, though no other business on the street showed any signs of life. The old woman was gone, but the candles still burned, and the heat still pulsed through that warped floor. This time, I could see stairs at the back of the shop, stairs I was certain hadn't been there before, leading down into a darkness that seemed to swallow light. "The invitation stands," she'd said. I stood at the top of those stairs for what felt like hours, feeling the heat rise up from below like breath, like something alive and waiting. The air that came up smelled of copper and earth and something else, something organic and ancient. From deep below came sounds, whispers in languages I didn't recognize, the shuffle of many feet on stone, and underneath it all, that rhythmic breathing that matched the pulse of heat through the floor. I wanted to descend. God help me, every fiber of my being wanted to go down those stairs, to find the source of that impossible heat, to understand what breathed beneath the French Quarter. My feet moved without my permission, taking the first step down. The wood was soft, almost flesh-warm, and it gave slightly under my weight with a sound like a sigh. The second step was the same, and the third. It wasn't wood at all, I realized with a sick certainty. It was something else, something that responded to my presence, something that wanted me to continue down. That's what stopped me. Not fear, exactly, but the understanding that this was a threshold I couldn't uncross. Whatever waited below had been waiting long before the French Quarter existed, long before New Orleans was even a dream, and it would wait long after. I backed away, my feet leaving wet prints on those impossible stairs. When had they become wet? And fled the shop. This time, I didn't stop running until I reached my hotel, packed my things, and caught a cab to the airport 4 hours before my flight. But it didn't matter. The heat followed me home. It's been 3 months now, and I feel it everywhere. Grocery stores, my office, my own bedroom, that pulse of heat rising through whatever floor I'm standing on. Sometimes I catch glimpses of symbols in the patterns of carpet fibers or the grain of hardwood, the same symbols that marked my shoes that night. They're spreading, becoming clearer, more insistent. I've started researching, diving into old city records and archaeological surveys of New Orleans. There are mentions, oblique, carefully worded, of settlements that predate the French colonization, of structures built not on the swamp but into it, down into something older, of heat where there should be water, of breathing stones, of invitations extended to those who walk above. Last week I found an old map in a university archive, hand-drawn and water-damaged. It showed the French Quarter, but underneath the familiar street grid was another layout, tunnels, chambers, and something vast and circular directly beneath where that shop should be. The cartographer had written a single word in shaking script: bouche, mouth. My own mouth stays dry now, no matter how much water I drink. It's worse when I try to tell anyone about this. My tongue turns to sand, my throat closes, the heat rises until I can't speak at all. It's as if the shop, or whatever breathes beneath it, doesn't want its story told. Or maybe it does, but only to the right people. the ones who will accept the invitation. I've booked a flight back to New Orleans for next week. I tell myself it's to find answers, to confront whatever this is, to break free of this constant burning presence. But I know the truth. The heat has been calling me back since the moment I left. Each pulse through the floor is a heartbeat counting down to my return. The old woman was right. The heat knows me now. And deep down, in that primitive part of my brain that recognizes predator from prey, I understand something else. I was never the one being invited. I was being tasted. The shop on Dauphine Street isn't a shop at all. It's a throat. And every tourist who stumbles in from the rain, every curious wanderer drawn by those impossible candles, is just another morsel being evaluated. Some, like me, it releases back into the world, marked and calling to others like some kind of beacon. Others, perhaps, accept that invitation to go downstairs. I wonder how many of us are out there, feeling that heat through every floor we walk on, our mouths forever dry, unable to fully speak of what we've experienced. I wonder if we're gathering somehow, being drawn back to New Orleans by instincts we don't understand. Next week, I'll know. Next week, I'll go down those stairs. The heat is so strong now I can barely stand it. Even as I write this, I can feel it pulsing through my chair, through the floor, through the foundation of my building, all the way down to something that breathes in the dark beneath everything we've built above. Sometimes, late at night, I swear I can hear that breathing getting closer to the surface. Sometimes I look at my feet and see those symbols starting to form in my own skin, faint but growing clearer each day. The invitation stands, it always has, and I don't think it was ever really a choice. Story 3. The mountains remember everything. That's what the old ranger told me when I first arrived at the park that spring, his weathered face creasing into something that wasn't quite a smile. I thought he was being poetic, maybe trying to impress upon me the sacred nature of the wilderness we were meant to protect. I understand now that he was warning me. I'd taken the seasonal position out of desperation more than desire. 6 months maintaining trails and monitoring wildlife in the remote western reaches of the park. The isolation suited me fine after the mess I'd left behind in the city. My partner for the season was a kid fresh out of college, all enthusiasm and outdoor gear catalogs, who talked endlessly about summit attempts and backcountry skiing. Within 2 weeks, the altitude and the work had beaten the chatter out of him. By the end, he barely spoke at all. Our camp sat in a grove of ancient pines, their trunks so thick it would take 3 men holding hands to circle them. The trees had stood there for centuries, maybe longer, their roots drinking from underground streams that carved channels through the granite. In the morning light, their bark looked like scales, and when the wind moved through them at night, they groaned with a sound almost human. The staff tents were heavy canvas affairs from another era, wood-framed and built to withstand the weather that rolled through these elevations. Mine was tent number 4, though there was no tent 3. That one had been destroyed the previous winter when a massive limb, weakened by rot and weighted with ice, had crashed through its roof. They'd cleared the debris but left the wooden platform, and sometimes I'd walk past it and imagine I could see the outline of where it had stood, like a ghost of habitation. The first snows came early that year, in late September, dusting the peaks and sending the last of the tourists scurrying back to their climate-controlled lives. We were scheduled to stay through October, closing down the backcountry camps and securing the high-altitude stations for winter. The work was hard, but straightforward. Dismantling bear boxes, draining water systems, boarding up ranger cabins. Each day we'd hike out to a different sector, returning exhausted to our canvas shelters as darkness fell. It was during the 3rd week of October that things began to feel wrong. Not obviously wrong, not in any way I could point to or explain, but wrong in the way your body knows a storm is coming before you see the clouds. The birds had gone quiet. Not just quieter, completely silent. The usual evening chorus of nuthatches and chickadees had vanished, leaving only the sound of wind through pine needles. My partner noticed it too, though he tried to rationalize it. He suggested migration patterns, claimed early winter had driven them to lower elevations. But I'd seen the way his eyes darted to the tree line when we walked back to camp, how he'd taken to keeping his headlamp on even inside his tent, the beam visible through the canvas like a frightened eye. The night of the last snowfall started beautifully. Fat flakes drifted down through the pines, catching the last light of sunset and turning the world into a snow globe. We'd spent the day clearing a rock slide from the Granite Pass trail, brutal work that left us both shaking with exhaustion. My partner had barely managed to heat a can of beans before collapsing fully clothed onto his cot. I could hear his snoring from my tent 20 feet away, deep and rhythmic, the sleep of the completely depleted. But I couldn't sleep. The snow had turned to rain around midnight, and the temperature rose unnaturally fast, making the air thick and oppressive under the canvas. The mountain began to make sounds, not the familiar settling of rock and ice, but deliberate noises, cracks like footsteps, groans like breathing. I lay on my cot, every muscle tense, listening to my tent's roof sag under the weight of wet snow. The canvas creaked with each gust of wind, the frame straining against its stakes. Water began to drip through the seams, cold fingers finding their way to my sleeping bag. My face, the back of my neck. Then came the first real sound. Not wind, not snow sliding from branches, but impact. Deliberate and heavy, like someone dropping a boulder from a great height. The ground vibrated through my cot frame. My partner's snoring never wavered. Another impact, closer. The stable fence, a wooden structure we used to store equipment, was only 30 feet behind our tents. I heard wood splinter, the screech of nails being pulled from posts. Still, my partner slept. I wanted to call out to wake him, but something primal kept me silent. The part of the brain that remembers when we were prey, that knows stillness means survival. I held my breath, counting heartbeats, waiting. The footsteps started then. Not footsteps exactly. That word implies something bipedal, something with a gait I could recognize. This was different. A pressing down, a compression of earth that made the ground beneath my tent platform groan. Circle after circle around my tent, patient and methodical, like something examining its options. The weight of it. I could feel the weight through the ground, through the air itself. Whatever moved out there was massive, dense in a way that seemed to bend space around it. The pine trees, those ancient giants, creaked in its presence like saplings in a storm. I thought of the destroyed tent, number 3, crushed beneath that fallen limb. Had it really been wind and ice that brought it down? Or had something tested its strength, found it wanting, and applied just enough pressure to make it look natural? A sound like breathing then, but breathing through no throat I could imagine. Wet and labored, it came from directly outside my tent wall. The canvas pushed inward slightly, as if something were leaning against it, testing its resistance. The frame groaned but held. Hours passed like this, or maybe minutes. Time becomes elastic when terror stretches it thin. The thing outside continued its patient examination, pressing here, breathing there, occasionally making a sound like satisfaction or disappointment, though I couldn't tell which. Dawn came gradually, the darkness lifting in stages like veils being removed. The pressure, the presence, faded with the light. Not all at once, but in a slow retreat that left me uncertain when exactly I was alone again. When full daylight finally penetrated the canvas, I forced myself to move, joints stiff with hours of rigid tension. Outside, the evidence was undeniable. The stable fence lay in ruins, massive timbers snapped like matchsticks. A trunk the size of a small car had fallen exactly where the fence had stood, its impact crater fresh and deep. But it was the marks around my tent that made my legs weak, circular depressions in the sodden earth, each the size of a dinner plate, pressed deep enough that water had pooled in them. They formed perfect circles around my platform, overlapping in places where the thing had shifted its weight, considered its approach. My partner emerged from his tent, yawning, stretching, completely oblivious. He looked at the destroyed fence, whistled low, and said something about how lucky we were it hadn't hit our tents. I didn't tell him about the sounds, the breathing, the patient circling. How could I? In daylight, it seemed impossible, the hallucination of an exhausted mind. We spent our last day in near silence, breaking down camp with mechanical efficiency. He assumed my quietness was exhaustion. I let him. As we hiked out that evening, our packs heavy with gear, I looked back once at the grove of ancient pines. They stood as they always had, primordial and patient, keeping their secrets. I've tried to research what happened since then. Searched park records for incidents, wildlife reports for anything unusual. There's nothing official, just gaps in the record where you'd expect to find something. Positions that go unfilled. Sectors of the park that get mysteriously removed from patrol routes. Tent 3 wasn't the first structure destroyed in that grove, and it won't be the last. Sometimes in my apartment in the city, surrounded by steel and concrete and the comforting noise of traffic, I wake to the memory of that breathing. I tell myself it was the wind through the pines, or my partner's snoring distorted by exhaustion and fear. I tell myself the circular marks were from deer or elk, or even bears investigating our camp. But I know the weight of what I felt that night, the deliberate intelligence in those patient circles. The mountain remembers everything, the old ranger said, and some memories walk on their own, searching for something only they understand. I won't go back. They've sent letters asking if I'll return for another season, offering better pay, better positions. I don't respond. Let someone else learn what watches from those ancient groves, what tests the strength of canvas and wood and human nerve. Let someone else lie awake through a night of patient circling, wondering if dawn will come in time. The mountains remember everything, and some things, once remembered, refuse to stay still. Story 4. The receipts started appearing 3 weeks after I told her no. Every morning, tucked beneath my doormat like a poisonous love letter, I'd find another printout of my bank statement on that cheap thermal paper that fades to nothing if you leave it in sunlight. The kind they use at grocery stores and gas stations. The kind that shouldn't exist anywhere near my financial records. I should start from the beginning, though the beginning itself feels suspect now, like a memory someone else planted in my head. Her laugh caught me first. Not the laugh itself, but the way it seemed to bend the air in that Pike Place coffee shop, making everyone turn without knowing why. She stood at the counter, negotiating with the barista about something trivial, her voice carrying that particular Seattle confidence that comes from knowing exactly which neighborhoods matter and which yoga studios to avoid. When she turned, our eyes met, and she smiled as if she'd been waiting for me specifically, though I'd never seen her before in my life. The courtship, if you could call it that, moved with the predetermined efficiency of a subway train. Coffee became dinner, became weekends, became keys exchanged within 6 weeks. She moved through my life like water finding cracks in concrete, seeping into spaces I hadn't known were hollow. Her things appeared gradually. A toothbrush, then clothes, then furniture that somehow looked more natural in my apartment than my own belongings did. By the 8th week, she'd redecorated my entire living room without asking, and somehow I'd thanked her for it. The lease conversation happened on a Tuesday. She presented it like she was doing me a favor, explaining how having 2 names would protect us both, how the landlord preferred couples anyway, how it just made sense. Her fingers traced patterns on my kitchen counter as she spoke, and I noticed for the first time that her nails were bitten down to the quick, though she'd painted them perfectly to hide the damage. Then came the bank account request. Just for emergencies, she'd said, her hand finding mine across the table. The speech was flawless, practiced but not rehearsed, emotional but not melodramatic. She talked about trust as the foundation of love, about practical partnerships, about how her ex had left her stranded once when her card was stolen in Vancouver. I almost said yes. The word was forming in my mouth when my phone buzzed. The email had no sender name, just a string of numbers where the address should be. The photos were recent. I could tell by the Thanksgiving decorations in the background. She wore the jade necklace I'd given her for our 2-month anniversary, the one she'd cried over, saying no one had ever noticed she loved that particular shade of green. But the apartment in the photos wasn't mine. The man beside her held a key ring, and even in the blurry image, I could make out the distinctive octagonal fob for my building security system. When I showed her the photos, she didn't flinch. She smiled, not her usual smile that crinkled her eyes, but something thinner, more calculated. She said it was just logistics, that I wouldn't understand the complexities, that jealousy didn't suit me. Then she went to bed as if nothing had happened, leaving me staring at those photos until my eyes burned. I told her no the next morning. No to the lease, no to the bank account, no to whatever game she was playing. She packed methodically, folding each piece of clothing with department store precision. Before leaving, she kissed my forehead and whispered something I couldn't quite hear, something that sounded like numbers, or maybe a different language altogether. Then the receipts started. The first one appeared 3 days later. A full statement from the previous month, every transaction visible in that ghostly gray thermal ink. I'd bought coffee at 7:43 a.m., gas at 2:15 p.m., groceries at 6:32 p.m. Someone had been watching, recording, printing. The paper was still warm when I found it, as if fresh from a register that didn't exist. I changed my account numbers. The receipts continued, now showing the new accounts, transactions from that very morning. I installed cameras. They showed nothing. The receipts simply appeared between one frame and the next, materializing like condensation on glass. The content grew stranger. Mixed between real transactions were others I didn't recognize. Charges at stores that didn't exist, in cities I'd never visited, for amounts that seemed significant but meaningless. 37, 41, 73, 14, $41, 37. Always palindromes or sequences, always adding up to numbers divisible by 3. I started keeping them, filing them in a shoebox that grew heavier each day, though paper shouldn't weigh that much. Sometimes I'd check old ones and find the ink had rearranged itself, showing different transactions, different dates, different versions of my financial life that felt both false and terrifyingly possible. Sleep became negotiable. I'd wake at 3:33 a.m. exactly, every night, certain someone was in my apartment. The air felt different, thicker, like breathing through wet fabric. I'd check every room, finding nothing except the sensation that the furniture had been moved by imperceptible degrees, that the angles of my walls had shifted slightly, that my apartment was slowly becoming somewhere else. My neighbor started avoiding me. When I asked if she'd seen anyone near my door, she looked at me with something between pity and fear, mumbling about stress and maybe seeing someone professional. But I caught her later, slipping something under my doormat, her hands shaking. When I checked, there was nothing there except another receipt. This one showing a transaction at a psychiatric facility I'd never heard of, dated 3 days in the future. The photos came next, printed on the same thermal paper. Impossible images. Me sleeping in my bed, but taken from inside my ceiling. Me showering, but from behind the mirror. Me walking down streets I recognized but had never walked. Entering buildings that felt familiar but wrong, like déjà vu in reverse. In one photo, I stood in what looked like my apartment, but everything was backwards. Not mirrored, but fundamentally reversed, as if built from blueprints read upside down. In the background, barely visible, she stood in the doorway, smiling that thin smile, holding papers I couldn't quite make out. I tried confronting her, but her number was disconnected. Her social media had vanished. The coffee shop where we'd met claimed they'd been closed for renovations during the time I remembered meeting her. The restaurant where we'd had our first date had no record of our reservation. Even the jewelry store where I'd bought the necklace insisted they'd never sold that particular shade of jade, that it didn't exist in nature, that I must be confused. But the receipts kept coming. I hired a private investigator, paying in cash to avoid more documentation. He returned my money after 3 days, his face pale, refusing to explain beyond saying some things weren't worth understanding. That night, I found his business card under my doormat, but the thermal paper had absorbed his information, leaving only the ghostly outline of letters that might have spelled "stop looking," or might have been nothing at all. My dreams turned transactional. I'd dream in receipts, long scrolls of thermal paper documenting every moment of my life as a purchase. Breathing at $0. Go-01 per breath. Heartbeats at market rate. Thoughts priced by complexity. In these dreams, she was always the cashier, scanning items I couldn't see, her register printing endless receipts that wrapped around my throat like scarves. The apartment itself began participating in whatever this was. Walls sweated thermal ink that formed temporary messages before evaporating. Check your balance. Transaction pending. Insufficient funds. The bathroom mirror fogged constantly, revealing fingerprints that weren't mind-spelling words in languages I didn't recognize but somehow understood, meant variations of owed and payment and collection. Last week I found something worse than receipts. A lease agreement, printed on thermal paper so long it pooled on my doormat like entrails. My signature was already there, though I'd never signed it. Her name was there too, but when I tried to read it, the letters rearranged themselves, becoming numbers, then symbols, then something that hurt to perceive directly. The apartment listed on the lease didn't exist, not at that address anyway. But when I walked by that evening, drawn by something I couldn't name, I found a door I'd never noticed before between two buildings I'd passed 1,000 times. The key in my pocket, the one I'd thought was for my storage unit, fit perfectly. Inside was my apartment, not a copy. My actual apartment, down to the coffee stain on the kitchen counter and the crack in the bathroom tile. But everything was wrong in ways I couldn't articulate. The shadows fell upward. The refrigerator hummed in harmonics that made my teeth ache. And there, on the kitchen counter, was a fresh receipt showing a transaction. One sol, gently used, market price. I ran, but running from your own apartment when you're already home is a special kind of impossible. Now I find myself checking my bank balance obsessively, watching for those impossible transactions. They've started appearing in my actual account. Charges that my bank insists are valid, from merchants they claim exist, for services they say I've received. When I protest, they show me signatures, security footage, documentation that proves I was there, making those purchases, living some parallel financial life I can't remember. The woman, I've started thinking of her as just the woman because her name changes every time I try to remember it, has begun appearing in my peripheral vision. Not her exactly, but the suggestion of her, a familiar posture in a stranger's stance, her laugh in the static between radio stations, her handwriting in the condensation on windows. Yesterday I came home to find my apartment key wouldn't work. The landlord, looking at me with confusion and concern, explained that the lease clearly showed two names, that she'd called about the lock change, that I'd agreed to it during our last conversation. A conversation I know never happened, but which he described in detail that felt more real than my actual memories. She answered when I knocked. My apartment, but her answering, wearing my clothes, cooking with my dishes, living my life with a precision that suggested she'd been rehearsing for years. She smiled that thin smile and offered to let me in, but only if I signed something first. A simple document, she said. Just a formality. Just logistics. The paper was thermal, of course. The text shifted when I tried to read it, but I understood enough. It wasn't a lease or a bank form. It was something older, more fundamental. A receipt for a transaction that had already occurred, just waiting for my signature to confirm delivery. I didn't sign. I couldn't sign. But my hand moved anyway. Muscle memory of signatures I'd never made, responding to commands from some part of me that had already agreed to terms I'd never read. I'm living in a hotel now, paying cash, avoiding documentation. But the receipts follow me. They appear under my pillow, in my pockets, between the pages of books I'm reading. Each one shows more impossible transactions, a financial history of a life that's mine but isn't, purchases made with currency I don't understand for goods that shouldn't exist. This morning, I found the worst one yet, a receipt for this story, dated 3 days ago, showing that someone had purchased the rights to my experience, to package and sell it as fiction. The buyer's name was smudged, but I could make out the price. Exactly what my soul would be worth if souls were traded on the open market, if such markets existed, if any of this was real. But the receipt is real. I'm holding it now, the thermal paper warm against my fingers, the ink already beginning to fade in the morning light streaming through my hotel window. Soon it will be blank, like all the others eventually become. leaving no proof except the weight of them in that shoebox. Paper that shouldn't weigh anything weighing more each day. I've started seeing others like me. People checking under their doormats with shaking hands, filing thermal paper receipts in boxes they carry like anchors. We recognize each other but never speak, as if acknowledging our shared situation would make it real in a way we're not ready to accept. Sometimes I wonder if she was ever real, or if she was just the avatar for something that feeds on documentation, on the paper trail we leave through life. Something that understands that modern existence is just a series of transactions, that identity is just credit history, that we are what we purchase. The receipts keep coming. Each morning, another warm slip of paper documenting a life I'm losing track of, transactions in a currency I'm running out of. And somewhere, in an apartment that might be mine, she's smiling that thin smile, adding my name to leases I'll never see, opening accounts I'll never close, living a life that's mine but isn't. I check my balance obsessively now, watching the numbers drain away, payment for something I never agreed to buy but can't stop purchasing. The thermal paper receipts pile up, documentation of my dissolution, proof of a transaction I'm not sure ever started or will ever end. Tomorrow, the receipt under my doormat will show the purchase of my resignation, my acceptance, my final signature on a document I've been signing all along without knowing it. The paper is still warm. It's always warm. Like it's just been printed by something that's standing right behind me, breathing numbers down my neck, waiting for me to turn around and acknowledge the transaction we both know has already been completed. I won't turn around. I can't turn around. But I know she's there, smiling, holding the receipt for whatever's left of me, waiting for me to sign for delivery of something I never ordered but have somehow always owed. Story 5. The motorcycle shouldn't have been standing. I stared at the vintage Harley-Davidson replica, its chrome wheels catching the late afternoon light streaming through my loft's floor-to-ceiling windows. 20 minutes ago, I'd left it lying on its side, wheels facing the bedroom door, a casualty of my clumsy shoulder bumping the glass shelf. The entire collection had trembled, and only the heaviest piece had fallen, landing with a dull thud that echoed through the industrial space. But now it stood upright, perfectly aligned with the other miniatures, facing outward toward the living area. Facing me. The intercom's sharp buzz still rang in my ears. 3 quick bursts from the lobby. Probably another delivery mistake for 4B. By the time I descended 4 flights and explained to the confused courier that no one by that name lived here, maybe 15 minutes had passed. 20 at most. I circled the glass shelf, my bare feet silent on the polished concrete. The motorcycle's miniature kickstand was properly deployed, its tiny mirrors positioned just so. Every detail was perfect, as if it had never fallen at all. As if invisible hands had carefully lifted it, dusted it off, and placed it exactly where it belonged. The thought sent a chill through the loft's open space, despite the October warmth still clinging to Detroit's afternoon air. I'd been collecting these pieces for 3 years, ever since moving into this converted factory building in Corktown. Each miniature was a perfect replica. Vintage cars, motorcycles, even a few classic Detroit muscle cars that reminded me of my grandfather's garage. The collection represented order in a life that had felt increasingly chaotic since the divorce papers were signed. But order required intention. Someone had to have been here. I moved through the loft methodically, checking every possible entry point. The front door remained locked, deadbolt engaged. The fire escape window showed no signs of disturbance, its paint-sealed edges intact. The building's security had been upgraded last year after a series of break-ins downtown, and getting past the lobby required either a key or an escort from a resident. No one else had access to my unit. The rational explanation felt flimsy in my hands, like tissue paper in a storm. Maybe I'd been mistaken about the motorcycle's position. Maybe the adrenaline from the intercom's jarring buzz had confused my memory. Maybe the fall hadn't been as complete as I'd thought. Maybe. That evening, I positioned myself in the kitchen alcove with a clear sightline to the collection. I nursed a beer and watched the miniatures through 3 episodes of an old crime series, waiting for movement that never came. The shelf remained static, each piece exactly where it should be. By midnight, my neck ached from the constant surveillance, and my eyes burned from straining against the LED strip's harsh illumination. I went to bed convinced I'd imagined the whole thing. The next morning, I discovered the first mirror. My loft's hallway stretched between the bedroom and bathroom, lined with 3 antique mirrors I'd salvaged from an estate sale in Grosse Pointe. Each mirror reflected the others in an endless, recursive loop that usually amused visitors. But that morning, walking bleary-eyed toward coffee, I caught something different in the leftmost mirror's reflection. A cardboard box sat beside the bookshelf, about 2 feet from where I remembered leaving it. I stopped, coffee forgotten, and turned to examine the actual box. It sat exactly where I thought it should be, flush against the bookshelf's base. But the mirror insisted otherwise, showing a gap of empty floor where the box should be and placing it several feet to the right. I moved closer to the mirror, studying my reflection and the background it revealed. Every other detail matched reality perfectly. The bookshelf, the scattered papers on my desk, even the coffee mug I'd left on the counter. Only the box's position differed. I stepped backward, then forward again. The discrepancy remained consistent. When I covered the mirror with a towel, the unsettled feeling in my chest didn't disappear. It burrowed deeper, like an itch I couldn't reach. The next few days established a routine I hadn't planned. Each morning, I'd inspect the mirrors, catalog any differences, then spend the day trying to rationalize what I'd seen. The middle mirror showed my desk lamp tilted at an impossible angle. The rightmost mirror reflected a book lying open on the coffee table, its pages spread like wings, though the actual book remained closed and upright in its designated place. The discrepancies were always small, always subtle, always just significant enough to notice if you were looking, which I couldn't seem to stop doing. I called my brother in Chicago, carefully avoiding any mention of mirrors or moving motorcycles. We talked about his job, the weather, the Lions' disappointing season, normal things, anchoring things. When he asked how I was adjusting to single life, I told him the loft was perfect, quiet, exactly what I needed. He seemed satisfied with the answer, and I almost convinced myself it was true. But late at night, when the building's old bones settled with groans and creaks, I'd find myself listening for sounds that weren't quite right. Footsteps that moved too carefully, the soft whisper of objects being repositioned, the nearly inaudible breath of someone who wasn't supposed to be there. The mirrors began changing more frequently, sometimes twice a day. The reflected world grew increasingly different from reality, as if someone was rearranging my life in a parallel dimension. Books appeared open to pages I'd never read. Chairs sat at angles I'd never chosen. Even my coffee mug migrated around the counter in the mirror's reality, though it never moved in mine. I started taking photographs, documenting each discrepancy with the methodical precision of a crime scene investigator. The camera showed what I saw directly, the real positions of objects, the actual state of my living space. But when I held the photos up to the mirrors, the differences became even more pronounced, as if the mirrors were actively rejecting photographic evidence. Sleep became elusive. I'd doze fitfully, then wake with the absolute certainty that someone had been moving through the loft while I slept. The certainty was never validated. Nothing appeared disturbed in the harsh light of morning, but it lingered anyway, a persistent anxiety that followed me through each day. 2 weeks after the motorcycle incident, I discovered the notebooks. They were mine, recognizably so. My handwriting filled page after page with observations about the mirrors, detailed catalogs of discrepancies, even rough sketches of the reflected arrangements versus reality. But I had no memory of writing most of it. Pages and pages of documentation I couldn't recall creating. The handwriting was definitely mine, the same cramped script I'd used since high school, the same unconscious loops and angles. But the observations were far more detailed than my conscious efforts, noted at times when I was certain I'd been asleep or away from the loft. One entry, dated 3 days earlier, read, "The reflection shows the motorcycle facing the window now. as if it's trying to leave. The real one still faces inward. Someone is teaching it to want escape. I had no memory of writing those words, but they were undeniably mine. The notebooks revealed a pattern I hadn't consciously recognized. The mirror discrepancies weren't random. They followed a logic, a progression. Objects in the reflected world were gradually being rearranged into more defensive positions. Chairs turned to face the door, books opened to specific pages, the motorcycle slowly rotating toward the exit, as if someone was preparing for something, as if the reflected world was getting ready to defend itself. I started avoiding the hallway mirrors, taking the long way around the loft to reach the bathroom, keeping my eyes fixed firmly forward when I had no choice but to pass them. But avoidance only amplified my awareness. I could feel the mirrors watching me, cataloging my movements, reporting back to someone who existed only in reflection. The collection shelf became my anchor to reality. Unlike the mirrors, it never lied. Each miniature remained exactly where I placed it, solid and unchanging. I spent hours arranging and rearranging them, finding comfort in their tangible responses to my touch. They were real in a way the mirror's reflections weren't. They were mine in a way the notebook entries weren't. But even that certainty began to erode. I'd position the vintage Ford at a specific angle, then return an hour later to find it shifted by degrees so subtle I almost questioned my own perception. The motorcycle, always the motorcycle, seemed to move the most, rotating incrementally toward the door like a compass needle seeking magnetic north. I began marking positions with tape, creating a grid system that would make any movement immediately obvious. The tape helped at first. For 3 days, nothing shifted beyond the boundaries I'd established. Then I woke one morning to find every piece of tape gone, not torn or peeled away, simply absent, as if it had never been there at all. The miniatures sat in their original positions, perfectly aligned, facing outward with an expectant stillness that made my skin crawl. That same morning, all 3 hallway mirrors reflected the same image, my living space but empty of my belongings, just bare shelves, clean surfaces, and vacant corners. As if I'd never lived there at all, as if someone was showing me how things would look when I was gone. I covered all the mirrors with sheets and tried to pretend the problem had been solved, but covering them only made their presence more oppressive. I could feel them behind the fabric, still reflecting, still showing their alternate version of my reality to no one. The notebooks kept appearing, filled with handwriting I couldn't remember producing. The observations grew more detailed, more paranoid, more concerned with preparations and defensive measures. One entry described detailed plans for securing the loft against intrusion, complete with diagrams I didn't remember drawing. Another cataloged every sound the building made throughout a full 24-hour period, noted with timestamps and intensity ratings. But the most disturbing entry was also the simplest. He knows I'm watching now. I read those words over and over, trying to summon any memory of writing them. The handwriting was undeniably mine, but the perspective felt alien. Who was he? Who was doing the watching? Was I the observer or the observed? The answer came that night, in the form of movement I couldn't deny. I'd been lying awake, listening to the building's familiar symphony of settling sounds, when I heard footsteps in the hallway. Careful, deliberate footsteps that moved with the confident familiarity of someone who knew exactly where every creaky floorboard waited. I held my breath and listened. The footsteps approached the mirrors, paused, then continued toward the living area, toward the collection shelf. I lay frozen, every muscle tensed, as the sounds moved through my loft with purpose. The soft clink of miniatures being repositioned, the whisper of paper being turned, the scratch of a pen moving across notebook pages. The sounds continued for what felt like hours but might have been minutes. Then they retreated, moving back through the hallway, pausing again at the mirrors, and finally fading into silence. When I finally gathered the courage to investigate, I found the motorcycle facing the door again, lying on its side exactly as it had been that first day. But this time, a new notebook lay beside it, filled with my handwriting documenting the night's activities from a perspective I didn't recognize. The final entry read, "He's starting to understand. Tomorrow, I'll show him the rest. I stared at those words until they blurred, trying to make sense of a situation that defied every logical explanation I could construct. Either someone had elaborate access to my loft and was conducting an impossibly detailed psychological campaign against me, or I was losing my mind in ways I couldn't consciously perceive. Both possibilities terrified me equally. Dawn was breaking over Detroit's skyline when I uncovered the mirrors. Each one reflected the same image. My loft, but occupied by someone else. A figure that moved with my gestures but wasn't quite me, arranging objects with careful intention, writing in notebooks with familiar handwriting, watching the real world through reflective windows. In the mirrors, I could see him clearly now. The other version of myself, the one who'd been rearranging my life while I slept. He looked exactly like me, but moved with a precision I'd never possessed, a purpose I'd never felt. He was everything I might have been if I'd paid closer attention, been more careful, noticed the details that mattered. As I watched, he turned toward the mirror's surface and met my eyes directly. His mouth moved, forming words I couldn't hear but somehow understood. We've been sharing this space for weeks. Now, we need to decide who gets to stay. The motorcycle lay between us, fallen in the real world, standing in the reflected one, waiting to see which reality would claim it permanently. I reached toward the mirror's surface, and he reached back. Our fingertips touched the glass from opposite sides, separated by nothing more than the thickness of silver-backed reality. In that moment of contact, I understood that the choice had already been made. The notebooks, the rearrangements, the careful preparations, they weren't the work of an intruder or the product of my deteriorating mind. They were negotiations, communications between two versions of the same life, trying to determine which one deserved to continue. The mirrors showed me who I could become if I paid attention to the details, if I stopped accepting disorder as inevitable. But they also showed me the price of that transformation. The other me, the careless one, would have to step aside. I pressed my palm flat against the glass, feeling its cool surface warm under my touch. In the reflection, he pressed back, and for a moment, I couldn't tell which side of the mirror I was really on. The morning light grew stronger, filling the loft with golden clarity that made everything seem possible, and nothing seemed certain. The motorcycle waited, balanced between falling and standing, ready to belong to whichever version of reality proved more persistent. I'm still standing here, palm pressed to mirror, wondering if the choice is really mine to make, or if it's already been made, and I'm just the echo learning to fade away. Story 6. The compulsion started small, like most dangerous things do. A detour here, a longer route there, always chasing the edge of weather systems across the Carolina Piedmont. Normal people flee from storms. I drive toward them. It wasn't about adrenaline or some misguided death wish. Nothing so simple. The pull felt more like hunger, a hollow ache that only eased when I found myself balanced on that razor's edge between safety and chaos, where the air itself seemed to vibrate with potential, where normal rules bent. The first incident happened on a Tuesday morning in late September. I'd been tracking a storm cell moving northeast from Charlotte, following the weather radar on my phone like some demented treasure map. The interstate stretched empty before me, asphalt still wet from the leading edge of rain. Overhead, the sky churned the color of old bruises. That's when I saw it. A dark cable descended from nowhere. Not lightning, nothing so clean or predictable. This thing moved with purpose, sinuous and deliberate, like a charcoal rope being lowered from the storm clouds themselves. It struck my windshield with a sound like a tuning fork made of bone. The impact spiderwebbed the glass. But that wasn't what made my hands shake on the steering wheel. It was the smell that flooded the car immediately afterward. Metallic and sharp, like copper pennies dissolved in battery acid. The scent seemed to coat the inside of my mouth, my throat, settling deep in my lungs with each breath. I pulled over, hands trembling as I examined the windshield. The impact point was perfectly circular, no bigger than a silver dollar with fractures radiating outward in too perfect symmetry. But when I looked up at the sky, searching for whatever had struck me, there was nothing, just gray clouds moving with their natural chaotic flow. The smell lingered for weeks afterward. I had the car detailed twice, replaced the air fresheners, even left the windows down during a rainstorm, but that metallic tang clung to the upholstery like a memory my vehicle couldn't shake. Most people would have taken it as a sign to reconsider their hobbies. Instead, I found myself plotting routes along storm tracks with even more dedication. The second incident came in January, during what the Weather Service called a surprise winter event. One of those freak snowstorms that drops 6 inches on the Carolinas and sends the entire region into gridlock. I'd been watching the radar, seeing the perfect opportunity. The highways would be empty, abandoned by sensible drivers. I could have miles of storm-wrapped solitude. I parked at a rest stop on I-85 and stepped out into the storm. The snow fell in thick, wet flakes that seemed to absorb sound, creating a cathedral silence broken only by the whisper of precipitation hitting pavement. My footsteps crunched with that particular hollow sound that only comes with fresh snow on unfamiliar ground. 50 yards from my car, the wind shifted. Through the white curtain of snowfall, I heard the unmistakable rumble of a snowplow. Heavy diesel engine, the scrape of metal blade against asphalt, the mechanical whine of hydraulic systems. But there were no lights cutting through the storm, no amber warning beacons or headlamp glare. Just the sound, getting closer. I froze, every instinct screaming at me to move, to run, to do anything except stand there like prey in the open. But my legs wouldn't respond. The engine sound grew louder, more immediate, until I could swear I felt the vibration through my boots. The scraping noise seemed to come from everywhere at once, ahead of me, behind me, circling like some mechanical predator. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped. The silence that followed felt different from before. Heavier, expectant, as if the storm itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what I would do next. I backed toward my car, never taking my eyes off the swirling snow ahead. My fingers fumbled with the door handle, and when I finally got inside, I sat there for 10 minutes with the engine running and the heater blasting, trying to convince myself that city maintenance crews work around the clock during winter emergencies. That hearing phantom machinery in the middle of a snowstorm was perfectly reasonable, but I knew better. Just like I knew that whatever had lowered that cable from the storm clouds 3 months earlier had nothing to do with weather. Since then, the sounds have gotten worse. It started with power lines, those thin cables that web the Carolina landscape, carrying electricity from substations to suburban developments. Driving past them used to be background noise, the faint electrical hum that most people filter out without thinking. But now, when the wind catches those wires just right, I hear something else woven into their song. Whispers. Not words exactly. Nothing I can parse or transcribe. More like the impression of language, syllables and rhythm that hover just at the edge of comprehension. The pitch sits one tone higher than my ears want to accept, creating a dissonance that makes my teeth ache and my vision blur around the edges. The worst part is how the whispers seem to know when I'm listening. On clear days, the power lines sing their normal electrical song. But let storm clouds gather on the horizon, let the barometric pressure begin its inevitable drop, and those cables become something else entirely. They become instruments in an orchestra I'm not supposed to hear. I've started mapping the places where it happens. Gas stations, highway overpasses, rural intersections, anywhere power lines cross the road in significant numbers. The whispers are strongest where multiple sets of cables converge, creating a web of sound that follows me long after I've driven past. Last week, I bought a digital recorder. The plan was simple: capture evidence, prove to myself that something objective was happening. But when I played back the recordings at home, all I heard was wind noise and the normal electrical hum of utility infrastructure. The whispers that had been crystal clear in my car, that had made my hands tighten on the steering wheel and my pulse quicken, simply weren't there. Which leaves me with two possibilities, neither of them comfortable. Either something is targeting me specifically, some phenomenon that exists only in the space between my perception and the storm-charged air, or my mind is constructing elaborate auditory hallucinations that feel more real than the world around me. I've been researching both options obsessively. Weather-related electromagnetic phenomena that could affect brain chemistry, infrasound generated by storm systems that can trigger paranoia and auditory distortions, quantum atmospheric disturbances that exist in the gap between meteorology and physics. But I've also been reading about auditory hallucinations associated with stress, sleep deprivation, and social isolation, about how the human brain, starved for meaningful input, will create its own entertainment in the form of phantom sounds and voices, about how paranoia feeds on itself, growing stronger with each incident until the line between perception and reality becomes meaningless. The research hasn't helped. If anything, it's made the uncertainty worse. 3 days ago, I drove out to test a theory. I'd found a stretch of back road in Iredell County where 4 sets of power lines intersect. Transmission cables, distribution lines, and 2 sets of local service wires creating a canopy of metal over a half-mile stretch of asphalt. According to my weather app, a storm system was building to the west, still hours away but already affecting the electrical potential in the atmosphere. I parked beneath the intersection and waited. The whispers started before the first raindrops fell, soft at first, barely distinguishable from the natural sounds of wind moving through cable stays and transformers. But as the storm drew closer, as the air itself became thick with electrical potential, the sounds grew more complex, more directed. I could swear the whispers were forming patterns, not words in any language I recognized, but something with structure and intent, rhythms that repeated, inflections that rose and fell in ways that suggested meaning just beyond my grasp. The pitch fluctuated, sometimes dropping low enough that I could almost understand, sometimes climbing so high it made my sinuses ache. And underneath it all, barely audible but definitely there, was another sound, mechanical, familiar, the rumble of heavy machinery moving through snow. I turned off the engine and rolled down the windows, straining to isolate the sound. Rain began to spatter the windshield, each drop striking with the kind of sharp percussion that only comes before the real deluge. The metallic smell was back, seeping into the car despite the open windows, coating my tongue with that familiar copper tang. The machinery sound grew clearer, not just one engine, but several, a convoy of phantom snow removal equipment grinding through a storm that existed 3 months in the past. I could hear the hydraulic whine of plow blades adjusting their angle, the beep, beep, beep of vehicles backing up, the radio chatter of work crews coordinating their efforts. But there was no snow, no winter, just the approaching edge of a spring thunderstorm and the impossible sound of machines that had no business existing in this time or place. I reached for my phone to start recording, and that's when I saw the cable. It hung motionless in the air 20 feet ahead of my car, not swaying with the wind like the power lines around it, but perfectly still, as if the storm itself was holding it in place. The same dark, sinuous rope I'd seen months earlier, but this time it wasn't descending, it was waiting. The whispers from the power lines grew louder, more insistent, and I realized with a chill that worked its way up my spine like ice water that they weren't random sounds at all. They were calling to the cable, summoning it, welcoming it back. The cable began to move, not falling or rising, but rotating slowly, as if surveying the area, looking for something, looking for me. I started the engine and reversed away from the intersection, tires spinning on the rain-slicked asphalt. In my rearview mirror, I watched the cable hold its position for another few seconds before dissolving into the storm clouds like smoke. The drive home took 40 minutes. I spent every one of them checking the mirror, watching for dark shapes descending from the sky, listening for the phantom snowplows that seemed to follow just outside my peripheral hearing. Now I'm sitting in my apartment, writing this down because I need some record of what's happening, some proof that these experiences are real, even if my recordings suggest otherwise. The storm that was building over Iredell County has moved east, and through my window I can see power lines swaying in the wind. They're singing again, that one tone too high whisper that makes my teeth ache and my vision blur. But this time, the sound isn't coming from outside. It's coming from the electrical outlets in my walls, from the phone charger plugged in beside my bed, from every wire and cable that connects this building to the grid that spans the Carolinas like a web. I think I understand now why I was drawn to those storms, why I needed to be on that edge between safety and chaos. I wasn't hunting weather patterns. I was being hunted. The whispers are getting louder. They're forming words now, not in English or any human language, but in something older, something that speaks in electromagnetic frequencies and barometric pressure changes, something that's been trying to reach me through every storm I've chased, every power line I've passed, every intersection where the grid grows dense enough to carry more than electricity. Outside, the storm is moving closer. I can smell the metallic tang seeping under my door, feel the electrical potential building in the air until the hair on my arm stands on end. The cable is coming back. They all are. And this time, I don't think I'm fast enough to run. Story 7. The house had been empty for 3 months before I finally drove up to settle Dad's affairs. 3 months of mail piling up, leaves gathering in the gutters, and silence thick enough to cut with a knife. The realtor kept calling about potential buyers, but I couldn't bring myself to sign the papers. Not yet. Upstate New York in October carries a particular brand of loneliness. The maples had already shed their crowns, leaving skeletal branches that scratched against the windows when the wind picked up. Dad's house sat at the end of a gravel road, surrounded by woods that seemed to press closer each evening. I'd grown up here, but 20 years in the city had made me forget how absolute the darkness could be once the sun disappeared behind the tree line. I'd planned to stay at the motel in town, but something about the empty house felt like abandonment, one more betrayal in a relationship already fractured by years of stubborn silence between us. So I threw my bag into the guest room, the same room where I'd slept as a kid whenever I got scared during thunderstorms. The mattress still held the same musty smell of disuse, and the blue wallpaper with its faded sailing ships looked more childish than I remembered. The first night passed without incident. I spent most of it downstairs, sorting through Dad's papers and trying to make sense of 20 years of accumulated life. Bills, receipts, photographs of people I didn't recognize. Had he made friends after Mom died? Had he been lonely in this big house? Or had he preferred the silence I'd always assumed was contentment? By midnight, exhaustion finally won. I climbed the narrow staircase to the second floor, brushing my teeth in the bathroom where Dad's toothbrush still sat in its holder, bristles splayed and hardened. The guest room felt smaller than I remembered, the walls seeming to lean inward. But fatigue is a powerful sedative, and I was asleep within minutes. I woke to screaming, not human screaming. Nothing with lungs could sustain that note. It was the house itself crying out, a sustained wail that seemed to emanate from the bones of the building. The ceiling above my bed vibrated with such intensity that flecks of old paint rained down onto the sheets. The sound penetrated everything, my teeth, my rib cage, the soft tissue behind my eyes. I sat bolt upright, heart hammering against my sternum. The sound continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. A mechanical shriek that suggested something fundamental had gone wrong with the house's infrastructure. A pipe bursting, maybe, or the furnace having some catastrophic failure. Then it stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the noise. It had weight, presence, as if the air itself was holding its breath. I reached for the lamp beside the bed, but the switch clicked uselessly. The digital clock was dark. Power outage then. Probably a tree down on the lines. I fumbled for my phone, using its pale light to navigate toward the door. That's when I noticed the doorknob wouldn't turn. Not locked. I could feel the mechanism trying to engage, but stuck, as if the wood had swollen with moisture. I put my shoulder against the door and pushed, feeling it give slightly before settling back into place. The phone's light revealed nothing obviously wrong with the door or frame, but something was definitely preventing it from opening. That's when I heard the footsteps. They came from the hallway outside, measured and deliberate. Someone walking the length of the corridor, their pace neither hurried nor casual but somewhere in between. The floorboards creaked in a rhythm I recognized from childhood, the particular song of someone trying to move quietly through a house that announced every step. I pressed my ear to the door, phone light extinguished to avoid detection. The steps moved past my room, paused at what would be Dad's bedroom, then continued to the end of the hall. They stopped there, directly outside the guest room door. "Hello?" My voice came out as a whisper, then stronger. "Is someone there?" The silence stretched taut as a wire. I counted heartbeats. 10, 20, 30, before trying the doorknob again. This time it turned easily, the door swinging open so suddenly I nearly stumbled into the hallway. Cold air rushed past me, carrying the scent of dampness and dust, like a basement that hadn't been aired out in years. The hallway stretched in both directions, empty and dark. I swept the phone's light across the worn carpet, looking for footprints or any sign of disturbance, but found nothing. The temperature difference was striking. The guest room behind me held the accumulated warmth of the day, but the hallway felt 10 degrees colder, as if the heating system had failed hours ago. I made my way downstairs, checking doors and windows. Everything was locked tight, just as I'd left it. In the kitchen, I found the circuit breaker had tripped. When I flipped it back, the house hummed to life. Refrigerator cycling on, furnace kicking in with its familiar rumble, normal sounds, comforting in their mundane predictability. I spent the rest of the night on the living room couch, telling myself that old houses were prone to strange noises and electrical quirks. Dad had probably dealt with issues like this for years. The footsteps were likely the house settling, floorboards contracting as the temperature dropped. The stuck door was just old wood responding to humidity changes. But I couldn't explain away that scream, the sound of something in genuine distress. Morning brought perspective, along with coffee and rational thought. In daylight, the house felt normal again. Just an old building with old building problems. I called around until I found a contractor willing to come out that afternoon, a weathered man whose truck announced him as an expert in historic home restoration. He spent 2 hours poking around the attic, basement, and crawl spaces, checking pipes and electrical connections. When he emerged from the basement, his expression was puzzled rather than alarmed. "Found something odd in that guest room wall," he said, wiping his hands on a rag. "There's some kind of damage to the drywall from the inside, like someone was pushing against it, hard enough to leave impressions." He led me upstairs and showed me where he'd cut away a section of wallpaper. Behind it, the plaster bore the distinct outlines of handprints, 5-fingered impressions pressed into the wall from the inside. But they were positioned impossibly high, at least 7 feet from the floor. "Could be from when the house was built," he suggested, but his tone carried doubt. "Sometimes workers get creative with their signatures, though I've never seen anything quite like this." After he left, I stood alone in the guest room, staring at those handprints. The rational part of my mind cataloged possible explanations. A tall worker using the wall for support, some kind of construction technique I wasn't familiar with, even artistic expression by whoever had done the original plastering. But rationality felt thin in that room, insufficient to explain the creeping certainty that something was watching me. The sensation started as a tickle between my shoulder blades and spread outward until my entire back prickled with awareness. I turned around repeatedly, expecting to find someone standing behind me, but the room remained empty. That evening, I called my ex-wife. We'd been divorced for 3 years, but she knew me well enough to hear the strain in my voice. "You sound tired," she observed. "Are you sleeping?" I found myself describing the previous night's events, editing out the more unsettling details. She listened without interruption, offering practical suggestions about old houses and grief responses. Her voice was warm and familiar, anchoring me to a world where strange noises had logical explanations. "Maybe you should stay in town," she suggested. "There's no shame in getting a hotel room. You don't have to prove anything to anyone." But proving something was exactly what I felt compelled to do, though I couldn't articulate what or to whom. Dad had lived in this house for decades without running away from mysterious sounds. If he could handle whatever quirks the building possessed, so could I. That night, I wedged a chair under the guest room doorknob before going to bed. It was probably unnecessary. The door had worked fine all day, but the precaution made me feel marginally more secure. I woke again to screaming, but this time I was ready for it. The sound was identical to the night before, that inhuman wail of stressed metal or tortured wood, rising from somewhere deep within the house's structure. But now I was conscious and alert, able to pinpoint its source. It wasn't coming from the plumbing or heating system. It was coming from inside the walls themselves, as if the house was trying to turn itself inside out. The chair I'd wedged under the doorknob was vibrating against the floor, chattering in rhythm with whatever force was shaking the building. Paint chips rained down again, and somewhere in the walls, I could hear a scratching sound. Fingernails against plaster, or claws against wood. When the screaming stopped, I lay perfectly still, every sense hyper-tuned to the smallest sound. The scratching continued for several more minutes, moving through the wall from my left to right, following a path that would take it behind the headboard of my bed. The footsteps came next, but this time they started from directly outside my room. Back and forth they paced, as if whoever was making them couldn't decide whether to enter or continue down the hall. The rhythm was different from the previous night, more agitated, less purposeful. I wanted to investigate, but the chair wedged under the doorknob held firm when I tested it. Either the wood had swollen again, or something on the other side was preventing the door from opening. The scratching in the walls grew louder, more frantic, joined by what sounded like muffled thumping. Someone, or something, was trapped inside the walls and trying to get out. The rational explanation occurred to me even as terror crawled up my spine. Animals, squirrels or raccoons, had gotten into the walls and were struggling to escape. The contractor had mentioned seeing evidence of old water damage. Maybe some recent rain had driven creatures inside, and they were now desperately seeking a way out. But animals don't pace hallways in measured steps. Animals don't leave handprints 7 feet high on interior walls. The sounds continued until dawn, a percussion symphony of scratching, thumping, and those deliberate footsteps. When natural light finally filtered through the guest room windows, everything stopped as abruptly as it had begun. I spent that day in town, researching the house's history at the local library. Built in 1923 by a mill owner whose family had lived in it for generations before selling to my father in the early 80s. No unusual deaths, no tragic accidents, no hint of anything that might explain supernatural activity. But the librarian, a woman who'd grown up in the area, remembered my father mentioning strange sounds during his first years in the house. "He came in asking about the same things you are," she recalled. History, previous owners, anything unusual. But after a while he stopped asking. I figured he'd either gotten used to whatever was bothering him, or it had stopped happening. Maybe Dad had learned to coexist with whatever inhabited the walls of his house. Maybe the sounds had become as familiar as the settling of old wood or the whistle of wind through loose window frames. Maybe he'd even found them comforting in the way that any constant presence, however unsettling, can become preferable to absolute solitude. That night, I removed the chair from under the doorknob and left the door slightly ajar. If something wanted to visit, I wouldn't barricade myself against it. The screaming started earlier this time, just after midnight. But now I was listening with different ears, trying to parse meaning from the sound. It wasn't random or mechanical. There was a rhythm to it, almost like language, like someone trying to communicate through a medium that distorted their voice beyond recognition. When the footsteps began, I got out of bed and walked to the door. Through the crack, I could see a shadow moving back and forth in the hallway, too tall and thin to be human, but too purposeful to be a trick of light. "I'm listening," I said quietly. The footsteps stopped. For a long moment, the house held its breath. Then, very slowly, the scratching in the walls began again. But this time it followed a different pattern, more deliberate and controlled. It was spelling something, I realized. Letters scratched into plaster from the inside of the wall, just above where those handprints had been discovered. I pressed my ear to the wall and listened as invisible fingers traced letters I couldn't see. The message, when it was complete, was simple enough to understand even through the distortion of plaster and wood. Help. The contractor returned the next morning to finish examining the walls. When he cut away more of the guest room drywall, his face went pale. Behind the plaster, scratched deep into the wooden laths, were dozens of words. Messages carved by someone trapped inside the walls, pleading for release, describing a darkness that had no end. Some of the scratches looked fresh, others were worn smooth with age, as if they'd been traced over repeatedly by fingers that never stopped trying to communicate with the outside world. "This doesn't make sense," the contractor muttered, photographing the inscriptions with his phone. "There's no space back there. These walls are solid, just studs and insulation. Nobody could fit inside them, let alone survive long enough to carve all this." But I was beginning to understand that making sense wasn't the point. Some phenomena existed outside the boundaries of logic, in spaces where the rules of physical reality bent just enough to accommodate the impossible. That evening, I packed my bag and loaded it into the car. The house could keep its secrets, its trapped voices, its impossible handprints. I'd done what I came to do, settled Dad's affairs, made peace with the past, learned to coexist with mystery. As I turned the key in the front door lock, I heard the scratching start up again inside the walls, but this time, the sound was different. Less frantic, almost grateful, as if whatever lived inside those walls had been waiting 20 years for someone to listen, to acknowledge its existence, to understand that some forms of imprisonment are worse than death. I drove back to the city with the radio loud and the windows down, trying to clear my head of dust and damp air and the lingering scent of something that had been waiting far too long to be heard. But even now, months later, I sometimes wake in the night to the sound of scratching in the walls of my apartment. And I wonder if some things, once acknowledged, follow you home. Story 8. The notification sound had become as familiar as my own heartbeat. 2 years of late-night conversations, of that peculiar intimacy that grows in the space between screens. Kieran understood me, he'd say, in ways others never could. His messages arrived at precisely the moments when silence felt unbearable, when the walls of my apartment seemed to press closer with each passing hour. "I can see right through your words to what you're really thinking," he'd type. And somehow, impossibly, he was right. He'd reference thoughts I hadn't even fully formed, anxieties I'd buried so deep I'd forgotten they existed. The uncanny accuracy of his insights should have unsettled me, but loneliness has a way of making the impossible seem merely thoughtful. When I finally ended things with David, a relationship that had been decomposing for months, Kieran's response came within minutes. Perfect timing. "You need to see me now. In person. Don't let this connection fade into digital static." The flight to Portland stretched endlessly. Somewhere over the Midwest, turbulence rattled the cabin, and I found myself gripping the armrests as my stomach lurched. The man beside me was reading, completely unbothered, but I could swear I felt someone's eyes on me from across the aisle. When I turned to look, passengers were either sleeping or staring at their phones, their faces illuminated by pale screens that made them look ghostly, translucent. Kieran's apartment occupied the top floor of a converted warehouse in the industrial district. The building itself seemed to lean slightly, as if the weight of years had slowly pulled it out of alignment. The hallway smelled of damp concrete and something else, something sweet and cloying that caught in the back of my throat. He opened the door before I could knock, and for a moment, I didn't recognize him. The photos he'd sent over the years hadn't captured how thin he actually was, how his clothes seemed to hang on his frame like fabric on wire. His smile was exactly as I remembered from our video calls, but in person, it seemed to stretch just a little too wide, lasting just a beat too long. "You made it," he said, stepping aside to let me enter. "I was starting to worry you'd changed your mind." The apartment was smaller than I'd expected, dominated by floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a view of the Willamette River. But it was the smell that struck me most. That same sweet, organic scent from the hallway, stronger here, almost suffocating. When I asked about it, Kieran just shrugged, mentioning something about old pipes and poor ventilation. That first evening dissolved into awkwardness. The easy conversation we'd maintained for 2 years seemed to have evaporated, leaving behind stretches of silence that felt deliberately placed, like pauses in a performance. Kieran would make observations about my appearance, my mannerisms, delivered not as compliments but as statements of fact. You touch your neck when you're nervous. You did that in our video calls too, but the angle was different. Now I can see how your pulse quickens. I tried to laugh it off, but his attention felt invasive, clinical. When I suggested we order takeout, he insisted on cooking instead, disappearing into the kitchen for long periods while I sat on his couch, listening to the sounds of preparation, the sharp rhythm of chopping, the hiss of something hitting hot oil, and underneath it all, a soft humming that never quite resolved into a recognizable tune. Dinner was elaborate, the kind of meal that required more effort than seemed warranted for a casual evening. Kieran watched me eat with intense focus, commenting on my preferences, my eating habits, as if he were collecting data. You always eat the vegetables first. I noticed that when we had video dinner dates. You're very methodical about it. I hadn't realized he'd been paying such close attention, and the knowledge sat uneasily in my stomach alongside the rich food. The bedroom was sparse. Just a bed, a dresser, and those same massive windows. Kieran had prepared the space carefully, candles arranged on surfaces, fresh sheets that smelled of lavender. But something about the room felt wrong, off balance. It took me several minutes to realize that there were no personal items visible anywhere. No books, no photographs, nothing that suggested someone actually lived there. Sleep came fitfully. The bed was comfortable enough, but every time I began to drift off, some small sound would pull me back to consciousness. The creak of floorboards, the whisper of fabric against fabric, the almost imperceptible sound of breathing that seemed to come from the wrong direction. It was near dawn when I woke fully, my body rigid with a fear I couldn't immediately identify. The room was still dark, but there was enough ambient light from the windows to make out shapes. Kieran was standing at the foot of the bed, completely motionless, his phone held up like he was taking pictures. The screen's glow illuminated my face, and I could see my own image reflected in his eyes, small, vulnerable, trapped. "What are you doing?" I managed to whisper, but he didn't respond. He just stood there for another moment, then quietly returned to his side of the bed as if nothing had happened. In the morning, when I mentioned it, he seemed genuinely confused. "You must have been dreaming. I was asleep all night. You know how the mind can play tricks when you're in an unfamiliar place." But I knew what I'd seen. The memory was too vivid, too specific to be a dream. Still, his certainty made me question myself, made me wonder if the stress of travel and the unfamiliar environment had indeed created false perceptions. The second day passed in a haze of mounting unease. Kieran's behavior grew more possessive, more intrusive. He seemed to know things about me that I'd never told him. The name of my childhood dog, the scar on my shoulder from a bicycle accident when I was 12, the exact way I liked my coffee prepared. When I asked how he knew these details, he'd smile that too wide smile and say something about paying attention, about really listening. His apartment began to feel like a carefully constructed stage set. I started noticing inconsistencies. Books on shelves that were clearly props, never opened, their spines perfectly aligned. Food in the refrigerator that showed no signs of being consumed. A bathroom medicine cabinet filled with products that looked untouched, arranged with museum-like precision. That second night, I barely slept at all. Every shadow seemed to shift and move. Every sound carried the suggestion of surveillance. I found myself checking my phone obsessively, but there was no signal, no way to contact the outside world. When I mentioned this to Kieran, he explained that the old building blocked cellular reception, that Wi-Fi was spotty at best. By the third morning, my nerves were frayed to breaking. Kieran watched me over breakfast with that same clinical intensity, making observations about my stress levels, my lack of sleep, as if he were documenting my deterioration. "You're not enjoying yourself," he said, not as a question, but as a diagnosis. I thought this would help us connect on a deeper level. but you're pulling away. The truth was, I felt trapped, observed, studied like a specimen under glass. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, but Kieran had a way of making my concerns seem irrational, paranoid. He'd listen to my complaints with apparent sympathy, then gently suggest that I was overreacting, that the stress of the past few months had affected my perception. When he left for what he called an important errand, I made my decision. I packed quickly, quietly, my hands shaking as I stuffed clothes into my suitcase. The building seemed different in his absence. The hallways longer, the walls closer, the sweet smell more overwhelming. By the time I reached the street, I was practically running. The Uber driver was a middle-aged woman with kind eyes who seemed to sense my distress without asking questions. As we pulled away from the building, I looked back and saw Kieran standing in one of those massive windows, phone in hand, watching our departure with that same clinical attention he'd shown throughout my visit. The flight home was a blur of relief and residual anxiety. I blocked Kieran on every platform we'd shared, deleted his number, tried to scrub every trace of our connection from my digital life. For several days, the silence felt like freedom. Then the emails started. They came from different addresses, always variations of common names combined with random numbers. The messages themselves were brief, usually just a photo attachment and a few words. Thinking of you. Miss our connection. You can't hide forever. The photos were what made my blood run cold. They were selfies, clearly taken by Kieran, but the backgrounds showed locations that looked disturbingly familiar. A coffee shop I frequented, the park where I jogged, the entrance to my gym. But it was the final photo that shattered whatever rational explanations I'd been constructing. It showed Kieran's face, that too wide smile clearly visible, with what appeared to be the lobby of my apartment building behind him. The distinctive marble pattern on the walls was unmistakable, as was the particular arrangement of the mailboxes. I called the building security office, described Kieran, asked if they'd seen anyone matching his description in the lobby. The security guard was helpful but certain. No one fitting that description had been in the building. The keycard log showed no unusual entries. The lobby cameras, he assured me, recorded everything, and there had been no unauthorized visitors. "Are you sure about the location in the photo?" he asked, and suddenly I wasn't sure about anything. I stared at the image on my phone screen, zooming in on details, trying to find some proof that it wasn't my building. But every element matched perfectly: the specific shade of the marble, the exact placement of the security desk, even the reflection pattern on the polished floor. That night I stood at my apartment window, looking down at the street below. The city sprawled in all directions, millions of lights marking millions of lives. But I felt completely isolated, completely exposed. Somewhere in that vast grid, Kieran might be looking back, watching, waiting, understanding me in ways I'd never asked to be understood. My phone buzzed. Another email, another photo. This time the background looked like the view from my own window, taken from an impossible angle, showing a perspective that could only exist if the photographer were floating in midair outside my 23rd floor apartment. I set the phone aside without opening the attachment fully, but the notification preview had shown enough. Kieran's smile, wider than ever, filling the frame, with the text below reading simply, "I told you I understood you. I told you I could see right through you. Now you're beginning to understand me too." The understanding he'd promised was finally arriving, but it wasn't the connection I'd imagined during those 2 years of digital intimacy. It was something far more invasive, more complete. The realization that came to me in that moment, standing alone in my apartment, was that perhaps I had never been talking to someone who wanted to know me. Perhaps I had been talking to someone who already did. Outside, the city continued its endless hum, indifferent to the small drama playing out behind my windows. But in the reflection of the glass, for just a moment, I could swear I saw another face looking back, not my own, but familiar nonetheless, wearing that expression of complete understanding that had once brought comfort and now promised something else entirely. The notification sound chimed again, as familiar as my own heartbeat, and I knew with absolute certainty that this understanding between us was far from over. Story 9. Pride has always been my particular poison, the kind that seeps into your bones and convinces you that admitting weakness is worse than drowning in your own stubborn silence. So when the snoring started, that freight train rumble that shook the walls and left me gasping like a landed fish, I told myself it was temporary. Stress from work, too much coffee, anything but what my body was screaming it actually was. The kitchen cabinets started their midnight symphony 3 weeks after I'd begun waking up with a taste like copper pennies coating my tongue. At first, I blamed the old plumbing. This house, inherited from my grandmother, creaked and groaned with the weight of 8 decades. Water hammer, I reasoned. Pressure changes. Perfectly logical explanations for the sharp bang that would snap me from whatever restless half-sleep I'd managed to find on the living room couch. But water hammer doesn't sound like impatience. It doesn't have rhythm. And it certainly doesn't make every piece of china in the kitchen cabinets ring like funeral bells. The sound became a ritual. I'd drift off around midnight, my body finally surrendering to exhaustion, and somewhere in the gray space between consciousness and dreams, the cabinets would begin their performance. Bang, 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 bang. 3 precise strikes, as if someone was testing the hinges, seeing how much noise they could make before I jolted awake, heart hammering against my ribs like it was trying to escape. I installed the security camera on a Tuesday. A small, wireless thing that promised crystal clear night vision and motion detection. I positioned it with a perfect view of the kitchen, convinced I'd finally catch whatever rodent or settling foundation was responsible for my sleepless nights. The first recording showed nothing but shadows and the pale glow of the refrigerator's ice maker. The second showed the same. By the third night, I was beginning to question my own ears. Then I saw the door. The upper cabinet, the one where my grandmother had kept her good dishes, the set with the tiny blue flowers that hadn't been used since her funeral, stood slightly ajar. Not wide open, just cracked, like someone had closed it carelessly. I watched the timestamp tick forward, 2:47 a.m. The camera's motion sensor had triggered, but the frame was empty except for that one rebellious door, hanging open like a mouth caught mid-sentence. I fast-forwarded through the footage, watching hours compress into minutes, and there, at 3:23 a.m., the door swung shut with enough force to rattle the frame. No hand, no breeze, no explanation. Just the door, moving with what I can only describe as purpose. That's when my cousin from the old country arrived with the photograph. He appeared on my doorstep unannounced, clutching a manila envelope and wearing the kind of smile that suggested he was doing me a tremendous favor. Family obligation, he called it. Cleaning out his mother's attic had unearthed boxes of photographs, documents, and keepsakes that belonged to our shared lineage. Most of it was heading for the trash, but this particular item, he insisted, belonged with me. The photograph was small, sepia-toned, and mounted in a frame that had once been ornate but now bore the patina of age and neglect. 2 men stood in front of a house that looked remarkably similar to mine. The same wraparound porch, the same peaked roof, the same narrow windows that seemed to watch you from whatever angle you viewed them. The men were dressed in the formal attire of the early 1900s, their faces serious and unsmiling in the way of old portraits. One was tall and lean with hollow cheeks, and eyes that seemed to follow you around the room. The other was shorter, stockier, with a thick mustache and hands clasped behind his back. My cousin rattled off their names and relationship to our family tree, but the details slid off me like water. What caught my attention was the address he mentioned, the same street where I now lived, just 2 houses down. These men, my great-great-uncles or some similar distant connection, had walked the same sidewalks, breathed the same air, looked up at the same sky I saw every morning when I stumbled to the mailbox. I placed the photograph on the kitchen shelf, right next to the window where the morning light would catch it. It seemed appropriate somehow, these old guardians keeping watch over the same neighborhood they'd once called home. That night, exhausted from a day of meetings and deadlines, I collapsed onto the couch without bothering to set up my usual pillows and blankets. Sleep took me like a tide, pulling me under before I could even kick off my shoes. The camera recorded everything. I discovered the footage the next morning, nursing coffee and trying to ignore the metallic taste that had become my constant companion. The timestamp showed 3:17 a.m. There I was, sprawled across the couch in an unnatural position, my head thrown back at an angle that made my throat look exposed and vulnerable. But it wasn't my sleeping form that made my hands shake as I held the phone. It was the cabinet door. It opened slowly, almost deliberately, revealing the neat rows of blue-flowered china. Then, with the same measured pace, it began to tilt. Not swing. Tilt. As if an invisible hand was testing its weight, feeling the resistance of the hinges. The tilt became more pronounced, and I could see the dishes inside shifting slightly, teacups chiming against saucers in a melody so faint the camera barely captured it. Then came the slam. The door crashed shut with a violence that made me flinch even watching the playback hours later. The sound was thunderous, final, and in the recording I watched my own body jerk awake with a gasp that seemed to echo in the small kitchen. My recorded self sat up, looked around with wild, disoriented eyes, then stumbled to the bathroom. I had no memory of any of this, but what disturbed me most wasn't the moving door, or my own forgotten midnight wandering. It was what happened in the split second before the slam. In that brief moment when the door hung fully open, tilted at its maximum angle, something in the recording changed. The photograph on the shelf, the one of my ancestors, seemed to shift, just slightly, as if the two men in their formal poses had turned their heads, just a fraction of an inch, to look directly at my sleeping form. I replayed that moment dozens of times, zooming in until the image pixelated beyond recognition, but I could never be certain. The quality wasn't good enough, the lighting too dim, the movement, if there had been movement at all, too subtle to confirm. But the feeling remained, settling into my chest like a cold weight. I was being watched. The episodes began happening every night. Each time I'd succumb to exhaustion on the couch, and each time the camera would capture the same sequence. The slow opening, the deliberate tilt, the violent slam, and always, I'd wake with that desperate gasp, as if someone had reached into my chest and squeezed my lungs back to life. My days became exercises in dread. I'd catch myself staring at the photograph, searching the faces of those long-dead men for some hint of recognition, some acknowledgement of the nightly ritual they seemed to oversee. During meetings at work, I'd find my mind wandering to the kitchen, wondering if the cabinets were moving even in daylight, performing their mysterious dance for an empty room. Sleep became my enemy. I tried staying awake, downing cup after cup of coffee, but exhaustion always won. My body would rebel, dragging me under despite my efforts, and I'd wake to find new recordings on my phone. Each one the same. Each one impossible to explain. The taste of copper grew stronger. My reflection in the bathroom mirror showed a man I barely recognized. Hollow-eyed, pale, with the kind of haunted expression I'd only seen in old photographs, like the one on my kitchen shelf. It was during one of those mirror examinations that the thought crept in. What if this wasn't about the house at all? What if it was about me? Sleep apnea could cause hallucinations, couldn't it? Oxygen deprivation playing tricks on the brain, creating patterns where none existed. The cabinet door could have been opening and closing on its own for years. Old hinges, settling wood, perfectly natural explanations. And the photograph, well, photographs didn't move. That was just my oxygen-starved brain filling in details that weren't there. But the recordings were real. The timestamps were real. The sound of china rattling in the dark was real. I made an appointment with a sleep specialist, then canceled it the next day. Made another, canceled again. The pattern repeated for weeks. My pride warring with the growing certainty that something was fundamentally wrong. Not with the house. Not with some supernatural visitation from my ancestors. With me. With the way my body forgot how to breathe in the deepest part of sleep. The way my brain starved for oxygen and conjured explanations that made the impossible seem logical. But if it was all in my head, Why did the episodes only happen when I slept near the photograph? I tested this theory one night, moving to the bedroom, as far from the kitchen as the small house would allow. I slept for 6 uninterrupted hours, the first peaceful night in months. The camera showed nothing. No opening doors, no tilting hinges, no violent slams to jolt me back to consciousness. The next night, I returned to the couch. The ritual resumed exactly as before. I began to wonder if the watchers in the photograph weren't trying to harm me but to save me. Each violent slam corresponded perfectly with a moment when my breathing had stopped, when my body had begun the slow slide toward suffocation. Were they my guardians, these long-dead relatives, shocking me back to consciousness before the darkness could claim me permanently? Or was my dying brain simply creating a narrative to explain the unexplainable, weaving stories from oxygen deprivation and family photographs? The question followed me through my days like a shadow. I'd catch myself holding my breath at random moments, testing the limits, wondering at what point my ancestors would intervene. The line between salvation and haunting began to blur. Were they protecting me from the apnea, or was the apnea protecting me from something else entirely? Late one night, as I prepared for another unconscious performance of our nightly drama, I noticed something new. The photograph had shifted, not supernaturally, but physically. Someone had moved it, or maybe I had, during one of my midnight wanderings that I never remembered. It now sat at a different angle, and the glass reflected the kitchen light in such a way that I could no longer see the faces clearly, but I could feel them watching. I could feel them waiting. And as I settled onto the couch, my body already beginning its surrender to exhaustion, I wondered if tomorrow I'd finally make that appointment with the sleep specialist. If I'd finally admit that pride was a luxury I could no longer afford. Or if I'd continue this strange dance with the watchers, letting them guard my sleep with their violent interventions, never quite certain if I was being saved or slowly driven mad. The camera sits ready, its red light blinking in the darkness. Soon the cabinet door will begin its measured tilt, and somewhere in the space between sleeping and suffocating, I'll discover once again whether my ancestors are angels or harbingers. The only certainty is that I'll wake gasping, heart pounding, lungs burning with the sweet agony of air rushing back into my starved body. Whether that awakening comes from supernatural intervention or simple biology, I may never know, but I'll be grateful for it all the same. As consciousness slips away and the familiar ritual begins, I find myself hoping that pride isn't the only thing keeping me from seeking help. Maybe it's also keeping me from asking the question that terrifies me most. What happens if the watchers stop watching? What happens if they finally let me sleep? Story 10. The crack of the rigging snapping cut through the Wednesday regatta like a gunshot, sharp and final against the gray expanse of San Francisco Bay. I was trimming the jib on restless wind when it happened. The sound carrying across the water with that peculiar clarity fog seems to give to disaster. The other boat, a sleek 40-footer I'd seen around the club but never sailed against, had been pushing hard toward buoy 4 when the wind shifted suddenly from southwest to northwest, gusting to 30 knots without warning. Their stay caught the mark somehow, and in the time it takes to draw a breath, their mast folded like a closing umbrella. What bothered me wasn't the accident itself. Racing sailors know the risks, know that gear fails and weather turns hostile without consultation. What bothered me was how the boat settled afterward, listing to starboard with what I can only describe as deliberate calm, as if it had been waiting for this moment, as if it wanted to lie down in the water and rest. The Coast Guard helicopter arrived within 20 minutes, its rotors chopping the fog into swirling gray ribbons. Red and blue lights strobed from the rescue boats converging on the scene, their sirens doppling across the bay in overlapping waves of urgency. But by the time we sailed close enough to offer assistance, the crew had already been pulled from the water, and the 40-footer was being towed toward the marina, its broken mast trailing in the chop like seaweed. Nobody talked about what had happened. Not really. The rescue boats had their radios, the helicopter crew had their protocols, but when we asked if everyone was okay, we got only terse confirmations and waves directing us to stay clear. The usual post-race chatter on Channel 72 was replaced by cryptic exchanges between official vessels, their voices crackling through static that seemed thicker than usual, as if the fog itself was interfering with transmission. That evening at the club, the bar felt different. The usual crowd was there, weekend warriors still in their foul-weather gear, grizzled veterans nursing whiskey and arguing about wind shifts, but conversation kept circling back to the accident with a gravity that didn't match a simple rigging failure. The bartender, a former merchant marine everyone called Skip, kept the handheld radios lined up on the bar like soldiers, their squelch knobs turned down but not off, so they whispered and hissed with distant transmissions. Around 9 o'clock, something changed. All 6 radios began receiving the same signal simultaneously, a low-frequency transmission that shouldn't have been possible on VHF marine channels. The sound was barely audible above the background noise of the bar, conversations, the clink of glasses, the old jukebox in the corner playing something by the Grateful Dead. But once you heard it, you couldn't unhear it. 4, 4, 4. The voice was mechanical, distorted, like someone speaking through water or from a great depth. It repeated the number with metronomic precision, neither urgent nor casual, just persistent. Skip reached for the nearest radio and twisted the volume knob, but the signal remained at exactly the same level, regardless of the setting. One of the old-timers, a guy I knew only as Reef, suggested it might be a stuck microphone somewhere, maybe on one of the rescue boats still out on the water. But when Skip tried changing channels, the transmission followed, appearing on every frequency with the same clarity, the same relentless repetition. 4, 4, 4. The conversation in the bar gradually died as more people noticed the radios. Someone mentioned that Buoy 4 was where the accident had happened, and suddenly the transmission took on a significance that made the room feel smaller, the shadows deeper. Outside, fog pressed against the windows like something trying to get in. I finished my beer and headed home, but the drive along the waterfront felt longer than usual. The fog had thickened to the point where my headlights barely penetrated 10 feet ahead, and the familiar landmarks of the Marina District seemed to have shifted or disappeared entirely. Streetlights glowed like dying stars in the murk, and more than once I had to slow to a crawl when the road simply vanished into gray nothingness. My apartment overlooked the bay from the 3rd floor of a converted warehouse in the Mission Bay area. On clear days, I could see all the way to Alcatraz and beyond. That night, the fog was so dense I couldn't make out the water at all, just an undifferentiated grayness that pressed against my windows like a living thing. I tried to sleep, but around midnight the sound started again. At first I thought it was coming from outside, perhaps a fog signal from one of the bridges, or a ship's horn somewhere in the bay. But as I lay there listening, I realized the sound was coming from inside my apartment. My own handheld radio, sitting on the kitchen counter where I'd left it after the race, was transmitting the same mechanical voice I'd heard at the club. 4, 4, 4. I got up and examined the radio. It was turned off, had been off since I'd gotten home. The battery indicator showed a full charge, but according to the display, the unit wasn't receiving or transmitting anything. Yet the voice continued, emanating from the speaker with perfect clarity. When I removed the batteries, the transmission stopped. When I reinstalled them, it resumed immediately. 4, 4, 4. I tried calling the club, but my phone went straight to a busy signal that sounded nothing like the usual AT&T recording. Instead of the familiar 3-tone pattern, I heard what sounded like static mixed with distant voices, all talking at once in frequencies just beyond comprehension. When I tried my cell phone, the screen showed full bars but no network connection. The fog outside had become absolute. Looking out my windows was like staring into deep water at night. Not dark, exactly, but empty of reference points, empty of the usual visual anchors that tell you where you are and which way is up. The city lights, the bridge spans, the navigation beacons that normally dotted the bay, all of it had vanished into gray uniformity. I found myself wondering about the crew from the 40-footer, whether they'd made it home safely, whether they were experiencing the same impossible transmission. But when I tried to remember their faces during the rescue, I realized I couldn't. Despite being close enough to see the Coast Guard pulling them from the water, I had no clear memory of the people themselves, just shapes in orange life jackets, indistinct forms against the gray backdrop of fog and water. The radio continued its mechanical chant throughout the night. I moved it to the bathroom, closed the door, wrapped it in towels, but the voice seemed to penetrate every barrier with the same unwavering volume. By 3 a.m, I was questioning whether the sound was coming from the radio at all, or if it had somehow gotten inside my head, a frequency my brain had locked onto and couldn't release. Dawn brought no relief. The fog hadn't lifted. If anything, it had grown thicker, more substantial. From my kitchen window, I couldn't even see the building across the street. The world had been reduced to my apartment and perhaps 10 feet of sidewalk below, beyond which lay an ocean of gray that could have concealed anything or nothing at all. I tried the internet, but my connection had slowed to prehistoric speeds. Web pages loaded partially or not at all, and when they did appear, they seemed wrong somehow. Familiar sites with unfamiliar layouts. News stories about events I didn't remember. Weather reports predicting conditions that didn't match what I could see outside my windows. The maritime weather forecast showed clear skies and light winds for San Francisco Bay. The NOAA buoy data indicated calm seas and unlimited visibility. According to every official source I could access, yesterday's fog had lifted hours ago, and today promised to be perfect for sailing. But the world outside my windows remained locked in gray stasis. Around noon, I decided to walk to the marina. If the fog was playing tricks with electronic communications, maybe I could find answers by talking to people face to face. I bundled up in my heaviest jacket and stepped outside into air that felt thick as cotton batting, moist and somehow resistant, as if the atmosphere itself had changed density. The streets were empty, not just of people, but of the usual urban detritus. No parked cars, no trash cans, no fire hydrants or traffic signs. My footsteps echoed strangely, each sound seeming to travel further than it should before being absorbed by the fog. I followed what I thought was my usual route toward the waterfront, but the familiar intersections never appeared. Instead, the sidewalk stretched ahead in a straight line that seemed to curve back on itself, as if I were walking on the inside of a vast gray sphere. After what felt like hours, I heard the sound of water lapping against pilings and knew I'd reached the marina. But when the fog thinned slightly, revealing patches of the dock system, I saw that all the slips were empty. Not just vacant, empty in the sense that the boats had never existed, the pier fingers extending into gray water like skeletal fingers reaching for something that had already vanished. The club building materialized out of the fog like a ship emerging from a dream. The lights were on inside, warm yellow rectangles in the gray void, and I could hear the familiar sounds of conversation and laughter. But when I pushed through the front door, I found the main room deserted except for Skip behind the bar, polishing glasses that seemed to never get clean. The radios were still there, lined up like before, but silent now. Skip looked up when I entered, his expression neither surprised nor welcoming, just expectant, as if he'd been waiting for me specifically. He mentioned that I looked tired, asked if I'd slept well. When I told him about the transmission, about the voice repeating the buoy number, he nodded as if this was the most natural thing in the world. He explained that radio signals sometimes get trapped in atmospheric layers, especially during temperature inversions. Maritime transmissions could bounce around the bay for hours, days even, creating phantom signals that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. But when I asked about the other people who'd been in the bar last night, who'd heard the same transmission, Skip's expression went blank. He suggested that perhaps I was thinking of a different evening, a different crowd. The club had been quiet last night, he said. Just the two of us and maybe 1 or 2 others who'd left early. I wanted to argue, to insist that the bar had been full, that at least 20 people had heard the radios all transmitting the same impossible signal. But as I tried to recall specific faces, specific conversations, the memories felt slippery, like trying to hold water in cupped hands. Skip offered me a drink, said it might help with the confusion. His hand was steady as he poured, but I noticed that his reflection in the mirror behind the bar seemed to lag slightly, as if the glass was showing me events from a few seconds in the past. I declined the drink and headed for the door, but found myself reluctant to leave the warm light of the club for the gray uncertainty outside. Through the windows, I could see that the fog had grown even denser, if such a thing were possible. The dock system was completely invisible now, and the water beyond might have been an endless gray desert for all I could tell. Skip mentioned, almost casually, that I shouldn't worry about the transmission. Radio signals sometimes took on a life of their own out on the bay, he said. They'd loop through the atmosphere, picking up fragments of other conversations, other frequencies, until they became something entirely new. Sometimes they'd even predict things, accidents that hadn't happened yet, weather that was still forming far out at sea. The way he said it made me look at him more carefully. In the mirror, his reflection was now a full beat behind his actual movements, nodding after his real head had already stopped, smiling while his actual face remained neutral. I asked him about Buoy 4, about what had really happened during yesterday's race. His smile didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes, like seeing movement in deep water. He told me that Buoy 4 had been removed from the race course 3 weeks ago due to a navigation hazard. There hadn't been a mark there during yesterday's regatta, he said. The race committee had published a course change, sent it to all the registered boats. But I remembered the accident clearly, the sound of the rigging failing, the boat listing toward the mark, the rescue boats converging on that exact position. I remembered because I'd sailed past that buoy dozens of times, knew its position as well as I knew my own name. Skip suggested that memory could be unreliable, especially under stress. Racing sailors sometimes experienced what he called navigational displacement, the mind filling in expected landmarks even when they weren't there. It was more common than people realized, he said, and nothing to be concerned about. Outside, the fog pressed closer to the windows, and I could swear I saw shapes moving within it. Not boats or buildings, but something else. Something that existed in the spaces between what was real and what was remembered. I left the club without another word and walked back into the gray world beyond its doors. The street led me home eventually, though I couldn't have said which turns I took or how long the journey lasted. Time seemed elastic in the fog, stretching and compressing without reference to clocks or the position of a sun I couldn't see. Back in my apartment, I found the radio exactly where I'd left it, batteries removed and sitting beside it on the counter. But as soon as I walked into the kitchen, the familiar transmission resumed. 4, 4, 4. This time I didn't try to stop it. I sat at my kitchen table and listened as the voice continued its mechanical chant, repeating the number with the patience of something that had all the time in the world. Outside, the fog showed no signs of lifting, and I began to understand that it might never lift, that the world I'd known, the city, the bay, the familiar landmarks of my life, might have become as insubstantial as radio waves bouncing endlessly through an atmosphere that no longer followed the usual rules. The transmission continues as I write this, has been continuing for what my watch says is 3 days, but feels like much longer. Sometimes I think I hear other voices mixed in with the mechanical repetition, fragments of conversations, weather reports from stations that don't exist, sailing instructions for races that will never be finished. I've stopped trying to reach the outside world. The phones don't work. The internet shows me only pages from a reality I'm no longer sure I belong to. The fog has become my horizon now, gray and infinite, containing possibilities I don't dare examine too closely. Sometimes I catch glimpses of movement in the gray, shapes that might be boats, or buildings, or something else entirely. They appear and disappear according to no logic I can discern, as if the fog isn't hiding the world, but creating it, moment by moment, from the raw material of memory and expectation. The radio reminds me that I'm not alone in this gray, between space. Somewhere out there, past Buoy 4 that no longer exists, in water that might not be water at all, other signals are bouncing through the atmosphere, carrying fragments of lives that may have become as unstable as radio waves in a storm. 4, 4, 4, the voice continues, patient and mechanical, counting down or counting up to something I don't understand, but can no longer ignore. And in the fog outside my windows, shapes move with purpose I can almost but not quite comprehend, navigating by signals from beacons that exist only in the spaces between what was and what might be. I should be afraid, but instead I feel a strange calm settling over me. The same indecent calm I witnessed when that 40-footer listed in the water after its rigging failed. As if this moment, this gray suspension between certainty and doubt, between memory and reality, has been waiting for me all along. The fog presses closer to the windows, and somewhere in its depths, I hear the distant sound of rigging creaking in a wind that carries no scent of the sea. 4, 4, 4. Story 11. The first time I saw it, I thought someone had broken down. Highway 62 stretches through the Mojave like a gray scar, cutting between Joshua trees and sand that holds the day's heat well into the night. I'd been driving this route for 3 years, hauling freight between Phoenix and Los Angeles, always taking the late shift because the roads were emptier and the pay was better. The desert at night had become as familiar as my own reflection, endless darkness punctuated by the sweep of headlights and the occasional shimmer of heat lightning on the horizon. It was just past 2 in the morning when I crested a low rise about 40 miles east of 29 Palms. The road ahead was a ribbon of asphalt disappearing into nothing, my headlights cutting through air so dry it seemed to absorb sound. That's when I saw the figure standing on the shoulder, perhaps 200 yards ahead. At first glance, it looked like someone waiting for help, a person in dark clothing, facing the oncoming traffic. But something about the posture struck me as wrong. Too still, too perfect. Like a mannequin positioned by invisible hands. I eased off the accelerator, my rig's engine settling into a lower growl. Company policy was clear about stopping for stranded motorists, but decades of late-night driving had taught me caution. Still, the figure remained motionless as I approached, and I found myself studying it through the windshield. It was covered head to toe in what looked like a hooded robe or coat, the fabric so dark it seemed to absorb my headlights rather than reflect them. The figure stood with perfect stillness, arms at its sides, hood drawn up and forward so that no face was visible. Just shadow within shadow. No car nearby. No debris. No explanation for why anyone would be standing alone in this emptiness. I was perhaps 50 feet away when it moved. Not walked. Not shifted weight from one foot to another. It simply glided sideways along the shoulder, maybe 6 inches, without any visible motion of legs or feet. The movement was fluid, impossibly smooth, as if the figure were mounted on hidden rails beneath the asphalt. My foot found the brake pedal of its own accord. The truck shuddered as I downshifted, air brakes hissing in the desert silence. But even as I slowed, even as every rational part of my mind insisted on finding an explanation, the figure glided again, another few inches, still facing forward, still perfectly motionless except for that unnatural lateral drift. I passed at maybe 15 miles per hour, close enough to see the fabric ripple slightly in the wind generated by my truck, close enough to notice there were no feet visible beneath the hem of that dark covering. And as I drew alongside, the temperature inside my cab dropped like a stone. The heater had been running full blast. It was December, and desert nights get cold. But suddenly my breath was visible in white puffs. The steering wheel became slick with condensation beneath my palms. Frost began forming on the inside corners of the windshield, spreading in delicate patterns that looked almost deliberate, almost like reaching fingers. I pressed harder on the accelerator, eager to put distance between myself and whatever stood on that shoulder. But even as my truck picked up speed, even as the warm air began circulating again and the frost dissolved, I found myself checking the mirrors. The figure had turned, not the whole body, that remained facing forward, motionless as before, but the hood had rotated, tracking my progress down the highway. In the red glow of my taillights, I could see that shadow-shrouded face following my movement, patient and persistent as a compass needle finding north. I drove the remaining 40 miles to Los Angeles without stopping, unloaded my cargo with shaking hands, and spent the rest of that shift parked at a truck stop, drinking coffee and telling myself I'd been hallucinating from fatigue. Nitrogen narcosis, maybe, from the altitude changes, or some kind of desert mirage, heat distortion playing tricks with distant objects. But 3 nights later, making the same run at the same hour, I found myself slowing as I approached that stretch of road. The rational part of my mind insisted the shoulder would be empty, that whatever I'd seen had been fatigue or optical illusion or simple misperception. The figure was there, in exactly the same spot. Same dark covering, same impossible stillness, same hooded face that revealed nothing but shadow. This time I didn't slow down. I kept my foot steady on the accelerator and passed at highway speed, but still the cold penetrated my cab like fingers of ice. Still the figure's unseen gaze tracked my passage, and still, when I checked the mirrors 5 miles down the road, that hooded head remained turned in my direction. I started taking a different route after that, adding an extra hour to my drive by swinging north through Barstow. The company dispatcher asked questions about fuel costs and overtime, but I told him the main highway was under construction. Not entirely a lie, since they were always doing roadwork somewhere along that stretch. For 2 months, I avoided Highway 62 entirely, taking my freight through the high desert instead of the low. But even on the alternate routes, even surrounded by other traffic and the lights of civilization, I found myself thinking about that figure, wondering if it was still there, still waiting. I began noticing dark shapes at the edges of my vision, trash bags that looked like crouched figures, shadows cast by overpasses that seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them. My sleep became fitful, filled with dreams of empty highways and something patient and persistent following just out of sight. After 2 months of detours and sleepless nights, I convinced myself I was being irrational. Desert highways were full of strange phenomena, ghost lights and mysterious sounds that could be explained by geology and atmospheric conditions. I'd let isolation and too many caffeine pills create a problem where none existed. The mature thing, the professional thing, was to return to my regular route and prove to myself that whatever I'd seen had been nothing more than fatigue and suggestion. I chose a Thursday night in February, when the moon was new and the desert would be at its darkest. If I was going to confront this fear, better to do it when conditions were at their most challenging. I loaded up on coffee, checked my route, and headed east on Highway 62 just after midnight. The miles passed without incident. Joshua trees stood like dark sentinels against the star-filled sky. My headlights carved a tunnel of visibility through the profound darkness, and the only sounds were my engine's steady rumble and the whisper of tires on asphalt. I began to feel foolish for having spent so many weeks avoiding this stretch of road. But as I approached that familiar rise, my confidence evaporated like moisture in the desert air. The figure was there, but not alone. 3 identical forms now stood on the shoulder, spaced about 10 feet apart, all facing the oncoming traffic with that same impossible stillness. All hooded, all dark, all wrong in ways my rational mind couldn't process. As my headlights swept over them, I could see they cast no shadows despite the harsh illumination. I should have accelerated, should have blown past them at highway speed and never looked back. Instead, I found my foot easing off the gas pedal, my truck slowing as if drawn by some invisible force. The speedometer dropped to 40, then 30, then 25. The figures began to move, not in unison, but in a sequence, like a wave passing from left to right. The first glided sideways with that same rail-smooth motion I remembered, repositioning itself to face my approaching truck more directly. Then the second, then the third, each movement perfectly fluid and utterly silent. By the time I was 50 feet away, all 3 stood at slightly different angles, their hidden faces trained on my windshield like flowers following the sun. The cold hit harder this time. My breath exploded in white clouds, and ice crystals began forming on every surface inside the cab. The heater fought valiantly against the sudden Arctic temperature, but seemed to have no effect. My hands cramped on the steering wheel as the metal became almost too cold to touch. I passed the first figure at walking speed, close enough to see individual threads in the fabric of its covering, close enough to notice that the material didn't move naturally in the wind. It hung perfectly still, as if each thread were weighted with lead. Close enough to see that where a face should have been, there was only depth, only darkness that seemed to extend far deeper than any hood could possibly allow. The second figure was identical to the first, but somehow I felt more weight behind its attention, as if multiple sets of unseen eyes were focused on my movements. By the time I reached the third, my truck's interior was so cold that my breath formed clouds thick enough to obscure my vision. I had to wipe frost from the windshield with my sleeve just to see the road ahead. But it was after I passed all three figures that the real terror began. In my side mirror, I watched the first figure turn to track my passage, then the second, then the third. But their movements weren't quite synchronized, weren't quite natural. The turning happened in stuttering increments, like stop-motion photography or broken video playback. A few degrees, then a pause. A few more degrees, another pause. As if whatever intelligence guided them was learning how to manipulate physical form, improving with each iteration. I pressed the accelerator to the floor, desperate to put distance between myself and those patient watchers. My truck responded with a surge of power that pushed me back into my seat. But even at 75 miles per hour, even with miles of empty desert behind me, I could feel their attention like a weight between my shoulder blades. Every glance in the mirrors confirmed what I already knew. 3 hooded heads still turned in my direction. 3 shadows still tracking my progress across the wasteland. From that night forward, the sightings became regular. Not every trip. That would have been too obvious, too easily explained. Instead, they appeared according to some pattern I couldn't discern. Sometimes one figure, sometimes 3. Once an entire line of them stretching along the shoulder like dark fence posts. Always in the same general area. Always facing the oncoming traffic. Always moving with that unnatural gliding motion when my headlights found them. I stopped mentioning it to other drivers. The few times I'd brought up strange sightings, I'd been met with knowing nods and suggestions about getting more sleep, cutting back on caffeine, maybe taking some time off. The desert played tricks, they assured me. Everyone who'd driven these routes long enough had seen things that couldn't quite be explained. But those explanations felt hollow when I was alone on Highway 62 at 3 in the morning, watching hooded figures materialize from the darkness like photographs developing in a darkroom. They felt inadequate when the temperature inside my cab dropped to freezing despite a functioning heater, when frost painted patterns on my windshield that looked too deliberate to be random. I began carrying a camera, thinking documentation might provide answers or at least proof of my sanity. But every photograph came back showing empty desert, vacant highway, nothing but asphalt and sand. The figures that stood so clearly in my headlights, that moved so deliberately in response to my approach, simply didn't register on film. Digital, analog, video, nothing captured them except my own increasingly unreliable memory. That should have been reassuring, should have confirmed what everyone kept telling me about fatigue and hallucination and the tricks that isolation plays on the human mind. Instead, it made everything worse. If I was imagining these encounters, why were they so consistent? Why did they follow rules, appearing in the same locations, behaving in predictable patterns, responding to my presence with what seemed like intelligence? And if I wasn't imagining them, what did it mean that they existed beyond the reach of cameras and recording devices? The worst part was the growing sense that they were learning. In the early sightings, the figures had simply watched, tracked my passage with those unseen faces, and then returned to their forward-facing vigil. But over time, their behavior became more complex. They began positioning themselves more strategically, spreading out along curves in the highway where my headlights would sweep across them at maximum visibility. They started appearing in my peripheral vision during daylight hours, dark shapes that vanished the moment I tried to focus on them directly, and they began following me home. Not physically, not in any way I could prove or document, but in rest stops and truck depots, in the brief hours I spent at my apartment between runs, I would catch glimpses of hooded figures in crowds, in doorways, in the corners of mirrors. Always at the edge of sight, always gone when I turned to look directly, always wearing that same dark covering that absorbed light like a hole in the world. Sleep became impossible. I would lie in bed listening for footsteps that never came, watching shadows on the ceiling that moved without any source of light to cast them. I installed motion sensors, security cameras, deadbolt locks, none of which detected anything unusual, none of which provided the reassurance I desperately needed. My work began to suffer. I called in sick more frequently, took shorter routes that avoided the desert entirely. The company's safety officer scheduled a mandatory evaluation, during which I sat in a fluorescent-lit office and lied convincingly about my sleep patterns, stress levels, and overall mental health. I passed with a clean bill of psychological fitness, but felt no triumph in the deception. Because late at night, alone with my thoughts, I had to confront an uncomfortable truth. I was no longer sure which version of reality was real. The world where hooded figures waited in the desert for reasons I couldn't understand, or the world where isolation and fatigue had finally pushed me past the breaking point into full-blown psychosis. Both possibilities were terrifying. Tonight marks exactly 1 year since the first sighting. I'm parked at a truck stop 50 miles east of Barstow, engine idling, heater running, trying to decide whether to drive the remaining stretch of Highway 62 or take the long way around through civilization. The rational choice is obvious. The safe choice. The choice that might preserve what's left of my sanity. But in the distance, past the glow of the truck stop's neon signs, past the pool of light cast by sodium vapor lamps, the desert waits in perfect darkness. And somewhere in that darkness, patient and persistent as death itself, something is measuring distance and marking time, waiting for me to complete the pattern I started a year ago. The clock on my dashboard reads 1:47 a.m. I put the truck in gear and pull onto the highway, heading east into the heart of the Mojave. Because after 12 months of avoidance and fear, after countless sleepless nights and mounting paranoia, I need to know the truth. I need to understand what's been watching me from the shoulder of this empty road, even if that truth destroys what's left of my grip on reality. The headlights pierce the darkness ahead, and somewhere in that tunnel of visibility, something is waiting for my return, something that knows I always come back, no matter how far I run or how long I stay away, something that understands, better than I do, that some patterns can't be broken, only completed. The speedometer climbs toward 55, and the desert closes around me like the walls of a tomb. Story 12. The house had been whispering to me for weeks before I found the room. I'd inherited the colonial from my uncle that October, a weathered structure that groaned with each New England wind. The realtor called it full of character, which I've learned is code for problems you'll discover gradually. The heating bills alone should have warned me, but I was desperate for space, anywhere that wasn't my cramped Boston apartment. The master bedroom closet had been giving me trouble since day one. The floor sagged noticeably in the center, creating a shallow depression that made hanging clothes feel precarious. I'd been meaning to call someone about it, but the estimate quotes kept getting pushed aside by more pressing concerns. The leaky faucet in the kitchen, the front door that refused to latch properly, the electrical outlets that sparked when I plugged anything in. It was a Tuesday evening when the floor finally gave way. I was reorganizing my winter clothes, moving the heavier items to the edges of the closet where the floor felt more solid, when I heard it, a deep, resonant crack that seemed to come from the bones of the house itself. The wooden planks beneath my feet split along a seam I hadn't noticed before, and suddenly, I was staring down into absolute darkness. The hole was roughly 3 feet square, with jagged edges that suggested the wood had been rotting from beneath for years. I grabbed my phone and activated the flashlight, peering down into what should have been the living room ceiling below. Instead, the beam revealed stone steps, worn smooth by age, descending into a space that shouldn't exist. The smell hit me immediately, iron and dampness, like old coins left in standing water. It was earthy but wrong, too metallic to be natural basement odor. I knelt at the edge of the opening, playing the light across the stonework. The steps were carved directly into bedrock, each one perfectly level despite their obvious age. Whoever had built them had done so with precision and care. My first thought was logical. This was some kind of colonial-era storage cellar, forgotten and sealed off during renovations. New England houses were full of such discoveries. The internet was packed with stories of homeowners finding everything from Prohibition-era liquor stashes to Revolutionary War artifacts tucked away in hidden spaces. But as I lowered myself through the opening, My rational explanations began to crumble. The space below was exactly the size of the bedroom above, no more, no less. The walls were the same smooth stone as the steps, fitted together without mortar in a style that predated the house by centuries. My phone's light revealed that the ceiling was low enough that I had to hunch slightly as I moved around the perimeter. The room was completely empty except for one corner where the stone dust had been disturbed. Not scattered randomly, but arranged in a way that suggested someone had been sitting there for extended periods. The pattern was too precise to be accidental, a clear semicircle where a body might rest, with smaller disturbances where hands might have traced patterns in the accumulated grit. I stood in that corner, trying to imagine who might have spent time here, and when. The dust pattern looked fresh, not decades old. Some of the markings in the grit appeared almost deliberate, like someone had been drawing or writing in the accumulated sediment. That's when I felt the first touch of something that wasn't quite air. The temperature in the hidden room had been constant since I'd descended, cool but not uncomfortable. But as I crouched in that disturbed corner, examining the dust patterns more closely, I felt a distinct change in the atmosphere. The air seemed to thicken, becoming almost tangible against my skin. It moved against me with deliberate pressure, like an invisible current flowing through the space. I stood up quickly, suddenly aware of how completely cut off I was from the world above. The opening in the closet floor seemed impossibly distant, and my phone's battery indicator showed I was already down to 30%. The logical thing would be to climb back up, seal the hole temporarily, and call someone to investigate properly during daylight hours. But as I moved toward the stone steps, the air current intensified. It felt like resistance, as if the space itself was reluctant to let me leave. The sensation was subtle but unmistakable, a gentle but persistent pressure against my chest and shoulders, growing stronger as I approached the exit. I forced myself up the steps anyway, pulling myself through the opening with an effort that seemed disproportionate to the short climb. The moment I cleared the hole and stood back in my bedroom, the pressure vanished completely. The air felt normal again, light and unremarkable. But as I turned to close the closet door behind me, I felt it. A definitive push against my left shoulder, gentle but unmistakably deliberate. The closet door swung shut with a soft click that seemed to echo through the house. That was 3 weeks ago, and I haven't been sleeping well since. The first few nights I convinced myself I was processing the shock of the discovery. Finding a hidden room in your house isn't something that happens every day, and it was natural that my mind would be active, working through the implications. I researched the property's history, diving deep into town records and historical archives. The house had been built in 1847 by a physician named Dr. Blackwood, who'd practiced until his disappearance in 1863. The official record stated he'd left town abruptly, abandoning his practice and property. But the newspaper accounts from that period painted a stranger picture. Several articles mentioned patients complaining about unusual treatments in the months before his departure. Nothing specific, just vague references to unconventional methods and patient discomfort. The property had changed hands frequently after that, never staying in one family for more than a decade. Previous owners cited various reasons for selling: financial difficulties, relocations for work, family circumstances. But reading between the lines, I began to notice a pattern of vague dissatisfaction that none of them seemed able to articulate clearly. The research should have been reassuring. Old houses came with stories, and most of those stories were more colorful in the telling than they'd been in the living. But instead of calming my nerves, the historical details only deepened my sense of unease, because I was starting to hear things. It began with the wall shared between my bedroom and the closet. If I pressed my ear against it, I could hear something that might have been whispers. Not words, nothing clear enough to understand, but a soft, rhythmic susurrus that seemed to come from the hidden room below. It was barely audible, right at the edge of perception, the kind of sound that made me question whether I was hearing anything at all. I tried recording it with my phone, positioning the device against the wall in various locations, but every recording came back empty. Nothing but the ambient sound of the house settling and the distant hum of the heating system. According to the audio files, the whispers didn't exist, yet they continued, night after night. growing gradually more distinct. By the end of the second week, I could almost convince myself I was picking out words. Not English or any language I recognized, but something with its own rhythm and cadence. The whispers seemed to come in waves, building to crescendos that made my chest tight, then fading back to barely perceptible murmurs. I started spending more time away from the house, finding excuses to work late at the office or meet colleagues for drinks. But the whispers followed me in my thoughts, playing in mental loops that made concentration difficult. I'd find myself straining to hear similar sounds in coffee shops or restaurants, wondering if the phenomenon was somehow following me beyond the house's walls. The third week brought new developments. I woke one morning to find the closet door standing open, though I was certain I'd closed it the night before. The opening in the floor was visible from my bed, a dark rectangle that seemed to pull at my peripheral vision whenever I tried to ignore it. I bought a sheet of plywood and screwed it down over the hole, thinking that might help. But the whispers only grew louder, as if whatever was generating them had been pressed closer to the surface, and now they seemed to be accompanied by other sounds, soft scrapings, like fingernails against stone, and occasional thumps that might have been footsteps on the ancient stairs. The recordings still came back empty. I tried different apps, various recording devices, even borrowed professional equipment from a friend who worked in audio production. Nothing captured the sounds that were keeping me awake and making my hands shake during routine daily activities. Last night, I finally worked up the courage to remove the plywood. The opening gaped like a wound in the closet floor, revealing the stone steps descending into perfect blackness. As I knelt beside it, the whispers intensified immediately, becoming almost conversational in their rhythm. I could swear I heard my name mixed into the susurration, called out in tones that shifted between welcoming and warning. I lowered myself through the opening again, moving more carefully this time. The hidden room was exactly as I'd left it, except for the dust patterns in the corner. They'd been rearranged into more definite shapes, spirals and intersecting lines that looked almost like writing, or maybe mapping. The configurations were too complex to be random, too purposeful to be accidental. As I studied the patterns, I became aware that I was no longer alone in the space. There was no sound, no visible presence, nothing I could point to as concrete evidence. But the air itself felt occupied, thick with a tension that seemed to press against me from multiple directions. I found myself turning frequently, checking corners that the phone's light had already revealed as empty. The sensation of being observed was so strong it made my skin crawl. Not the casual awareness of being seen, but something far more intimate. The feeling of being studied, cataloged, evaluated by an intelligence that remained just beyond perception. I stayed down there for nearly an hour, waiting for something to happen, trying to understand what the space wanted from me. The whispers continued throughout, sometimes seeming to come from the walls themselves, other times appearing to originate just behind my left shoulder. When I finally climbed back up, the push against my shoulder was stronger than before, more insistent. The closet door didn't just swing shut. It slammed with enough force to rattle the frame and make me stumble backward. Now I'm sitting here at my kitchen table at 3 a.m, writing this down because sleep has become impossible. The whispers have followed me throughout the house. They emanate from walls, from the spaces between floorboards, from the gaps around windows and doors. Everywhere I go, the soft, rhythmic susurration continues, just below the threshold of normal hearing, but too persistent to ignore. I've stopped trying to record them. The equipment fails to capture what my ears detect so clearly, and the disconnect between what I experience and what the technology registers is more unsettling than helpful. Either the sounds exist in some frequency range beyond normal recording capabilities, or my mind is generating them through some mechanism I don't understand. The rational part of me knows I should leave, pack my essentials, find temporary housing, and figure out what's happening from a safe distance. Sell the house, take the loss, and move on with my life in a place where the walls don't whisper and hidden rooms don't make the air feel thick with unseen presence. But I can't bring myself to go, because the whispers aren't random anymore. They're trying to tell me something, and I'm beginning to understand fragments of what they're saying. The language is becoming familiar, even though I know I've never heard it before. The rhythms match patterns that feel encoded in my consciousness, like recovered memories of conversations I never had. And sometimes, when I press my ear to the bedroom wall in the perfect silence of pre-dawn hours, I swear I can hear my own voice whispering back. Story 13. The first time I heard him play, the fluorescent lights in the Riverside Public Library seemed to flicker in rhythm with his finger-picking. I'd been researching local folk traditions for my thesis when the soft melody drifted from the community room, weaving between the whispers of turning pages and the distant hum of the heating system. November in Cedar Falls meant early darkness, and the library's windows had already turned into black mirrors reflecting our hunched forms among the stacks. His voice carried a slight accent that suggested rain-soaked streets and industrial chimneys, though when I later asked, he claimed Manchester as home with the casual certainty of someone reciting their address. The guitar case at his feet bore stickers from venues I'd never heard of, their edges curled and faded like old photographs left in sunlight. Something about his presence pulled at the edges of my attention even when I tried to focus on my research. He appeared at the library most evenings around 7, setting up in whatever corner offered the best acoustics. Never the same spot twice, as if he were mapping the building's hidden resonances. The librarians tolerated him because his music never rose above a whisper, and because he had a way of making people linger, creating an audience from the scattered souls who sought refuge among the books. I began timing my visits to coincide with his performances, though I told myself it was coincidence. The melody lines he crafted seemed designed to burrow into memory, surfacing later at odd moments when I was trying to sleep or walking across campus. His songs had no names that I knew of, and when I asked about them, he'd smile and mention something about old traditions passed down through generations like genetic code. The first inconsistency should have been a warning. During one of our brief conversations, he mentioned playing the Manchester Apollo in '98, but later referred to a gig at the same venue in 2003 as his first time there. The details shifted like sand whenever I tried to pin them down, but his stories were delivered with such casual confidence that I found myself doubting my own memory rather than his. He had a way of appearing in peripheral vision before materializing fully, as if reality needed a moment to catch up with his presence. I'd be scanning the philosophy section and catch a glimpse of movement, only to find him already seated in the far corner, tuning his guitar with the deliberate precision of ritual. The night I invited him for coffee marked the beginning of what I can only describe as a gradual displacement of certainty. We sat in the campus cafe, fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows across the orange plastic furniture. He spoke about growing up near the Pennines, describing fog that rolled down from the moors like something alive, but his accent seemed to fade in and out like a radio station drifting beyond range. When I mentioned my own background, growing up in wheat fields that stretched to every horizon, he nodded with the kind of recognition that suggested shared experience. But then he asked questions that revealed a geographic understanding too precise for casual knowledge. He knew about the abandoned grain elevator on Route 20, the one that had been empty since I was 12. He described the way sunset painted its rusty sides with an accuracy that made my skin crawl with the peculiar chill of being truly seen. The field trip to the Natural History Museum should have been routine. 3 hours of cataloging regional artifacts for Dr. Hernandez's class, followed by a brief presentation on cultural preservation techniques. I'd packed my notebook and camera, prepared for another afternoon of dusty display cases and carefully controlled lighting. He was there before I arrived, studying a collection of pioneer tools with the absorbed attention of someone reading scripture. The coincidence felt electric in my nervous system, setting off alarm bells that I couldn't quite justify. Cedar Falls wasn't a large town, but it wasn't small enough for random encounters to feel inevitable. Throughout the afternoon, he maintained a careful distance, always one room away, always studying something just out of my direct line of sight. When I moved to the geological displays, I'd catch glimpses of him examining historical photographs. When I focused on Native American artifacts, the soft sound of his breathing would drift from the pioneer section. He never approached directly, never initiated conversation, but his presence pressed against my awareness like a bruise that hadn't yet formed. The museum's layout encouraged circular movement, visitors flowing through connected galleries in a predictable pattern. But his positioning defied this logic. As if he understood the building's rhythms better than the docents who worked there daily, he appeared wherever I intended to go before I'd fully decided to go there, standing in spaces I'd planned to occupy with the patient certainty of someone who'd been waiting. During my lunch break, I sat on the museum steps and scrolled through social media, needing the familiar distraction of other people's curated lives. My notifications showed the usual mix of friend updates and academic announcements, but buried among them was a comment on a photo I'd posted the previous week, a sunset shot taken from my apartment window, capturing the specific angle of light that falls across Cedar Falls at 7:23 p.m. The comment was generic, a single heart emoji from an account I didn't recognize. But the profile picture, barely visible in thumbnail form, showed a familiar silhouette against what looked like evening light. My thumb hovered over the screen as recognition crawled up my spine like cold fingers. I'd been careful about my privacy settings, restricting visibility to friends and their friends. The account that had liked my photo shouldn't have been able to see it. I clicked through to the profile, but it had vanished, leaving only the ghost of its interaction in my notification history. That evening, I mentioned the museum encounter to my partner, describing it as one of those weird small-town coincidences that feel more significant than they are. But as I spoke, I watched his expression change, recognition dawning like storm clouds gathering on a clear horizon. He asked to see my phone, scrolling through my recent photos with the methodical thoroughness of someone searching for evidence. When he found the musician's face among the candid shots from the library, his reaction was immediate and visceral, a sharp intake of breath followed by the kind of silence that precedes revelation. The name he spoke wasn't the one I'd been given. According to my partner, the man in my photographs had a history that stretched back through various online communities, a pattern of manufactured identities and carefully crafted deceptions, dating profiles with different names and backstories, social media accounts that contradicted each other, a trail of digital breadcrumbs that led nowhere and everywhere simultaneously. The confrontation happened the next evening at the library. I found him in his usual spot, guitar case open, fingers dancing across strings in a melody that seemed designed to dissolve memory. When I approached, he looked up with the mild curiosity of someone being interrupted during prayer. I presented the information carefully, watching his face for signs of recognition or guilt. Instead, he smiled with the serene confidence of someone who'd been expecting this conversation for years. From his wallet, he produced not one identification card, but 3, each bearing his photograph, but different names, different addresses, different birth dates. He held them up like playing cards, fanning them with theatrical precision. His explanation was delivered in that accent that seemed to strengthen and fade according to some internal rhythm. Identity was performance, reality was consensus, and authenticity was just another mask people wore to feel comfortable in their own skin. The ease with which he demonstrated his deception was more disturbing than the deception itself. He spoke about fake identification with the casual expertise of someone discussing weather patterns, mentioning online resources and printing techniques with the detached interest of an academic describing research methodology. When I asked why, his answer came wrapped in philosophy and folk wisdom, something about truth being too narrow a concept for the full spectrum of human experience. He packed his guitar with the methodical care of someone who'd performed this ritual countless times, each movement precise and economical. I blocked his social media accounts that night, deleted his phone number, and removed every photograph that contained his image. The digital purge felt like exorcism, each deletion accompanied by a small sense of liberation. But technology had become merely one dimension of his presence, and my attempts at digital cleansing proved insufficient for the task at hand. The new accounts began appearing within days. Different usernames, different profile pictures, but always recognizable through some subtle detail that suggested the same consciousness operating multiple identities. A particular way of framing selfies, an identical slight tilt of the head, captions that echoed phrases he'd used in person. These new digital manifestations demonstrated knowledge that shouldn't have been accessible to someone I'd blocked. Photos taken from angles that revealed my daily routes, my favorite study locations, the coffee shops where I spent afternoons reading. The images weren't threatening in any obvious way, but they suggested surveillance with the persistent attention of someone conducting long-term research. I began varying my routines, taking different paths across campus, studying in new locations, shopping at different stores. But the photos continued appearing, always showing places I'd been, always taken from vantage points that suggested patient observation. The timestamps revealed a pattern of documentation that covered most of my waking hours. Sleep became elusive, pursued by the certainty that someone was mapping my existence with scientific precision. Every unfamiliar car parked on my street, every stranger who seemed to linger too long in peripheral vision, every coincidental encounter with someone reading the same book or ordering the same coffee became potential evidence of orchestrated surveillance. The rational part of my mind insisted this was paranoia, the natural result of discovering deception where I'd expected honesty. But rationality proved insufficient against the accumulating evidence of my daily life being observed, cataloged, and reproduced in digital form for purposes I couldn't comprehend. My partner suggested involving campus security, but what could I report? That someone was taking photographs in public spaces, that social media accounts were posting content that made me uncomfortable. The behavior existed in the gray areas between harassment and coincidence, too subtle for official intervention, but too persistent for peace of mind. The library became a space I actively avoided, though my thesis research suffered as a result. I found myself taking circuitous routes that avoided the building entirely, as if its yellow brick facade had become contaminated with memories I couldn't safely process. But even my avoidance felt observed, my absence noted and cataloged with the same attention that had once been directed at my presence. Winter deepened around Cedar Falls, transforming familiar landscapes into something foreign and threatening. The bare trees created new sightlines across campus, their skeletal branches offering insufficient cover for someone who felt perpetually exposed. Snow-muffled sounds that might have provided warning, creating a world where footsteps could approach unheard until they were close enough to matter. The photographs began showing seasonal changes I hadn't yet noticed myself. The first frost on my apartment building's windows, the way ice formed specific patterns on the pond near the graduate library, snowdrifts that accumulated in corners only someone watching carefully would have observed. These images appeared online before I'd consciously registered the changes they documented, as if my observer possessed a more acute awareness of my environment than I did myself. My thesis advisor expressed concern about my declining productivity, my increased absence from department functions, my general withdrawal from academic community. I fabricated explanations about family stress and financial concerns, unwilling to describe the real reason for my increasing isolation. How could I explain that reality itself had become unreliable, that the boundaries between observation and paranoia had dissolved into something I could no longer navigate with confidence? The musicians' performances at other locations around town became part of local folklore, though no one could agree on details. Some claimed to have heard him playing in Pioneer Park during lunch hours. Others insisted they'd seen him performing outside the farmers' market on Saturday mornings. But when I asked for specifics, the stories shifted and contradicted each other, as if the same performance was being remembered differently by each observer. I began documenting these reports, creating a map of sightings that revealed no clear pattern. He appeared everywhere and nowhere, always described in terms that suggested familiarity, but never in ways that allowed verification. The acoustic guitar was consistent, as was the slight accent and the repertoire of unnamed songs, but everything else existed in a state of constant flux. The winter solstice brought the year's longest night, and with it a photograph that shattered what remained of my rational framework. Posted to one of the accounts I'd been monitoring, it showed my apartment building from an angle that should have been impossible, too high for street level, too low for the surrounding buildings, taken from a vantage point that didn't correspond to any physical location I could identify. The timestamp indicated the photo had been taken at 3:17 a.m., but I'd been awake at that time, standing at my bedroom window, looking out at the empty street below. I remembered the moment precisely because I'd been checking for signs of surveillance, scanning for unfamiliar cars or figures lurking in shadows. The street had been empty, snow falling steadily under the amber streetlights, creating the kind of peaceful urban solitude that only exists in the deep hours of winter nights. Yet someone had been there, positioned impossibly in space, documenting my act of looking while remaining invisible to my observation. The photograph existed as proof of a presence that defied physical law, suggesting either technology I didn't understand or phenomena that existed outside my framework for comprehending reality. I printed the image and studied it with magnification, searching for signs of digital manipulation or composite construction. But the lighting was consistent, the shadows fell naturally, and every detail matched my memory of that specific moment in time. If it was fabricated, the craftsmanship exceeded anything I could identify or explain. Spring's arrival brought no relief, only new forms of documentation. The photographs now showed seasonal transitions with prophetic accuracy. Buds on trees that wouldn't bloom for weeks, grass beginning to green in patches that were still snow-covered when I checked them personally. These images suggested either time-lapse photography taken over extended periods or knowledge of natural processes that bordered on supernatural understanding. The accounts multiplied faster than I could identify and block them, a hydra of digital identity that regenerated endlessly. Each new profile contained subtle references to previous incarnations, creating a genealogy of deception that stretched back further than I'd initially realized. Some accounts showed posting histories that predated our first encounter by months, suggesting preparation for a relationship I'd believed to be spontaneous. My academic performance deteriorated beyond recovery. The thesis that had once felt achievable became impossible to complete. My research notes scattered and incomplete. My analysis fragmented by the persistent certainty that someone was reading over my shoulder even when I worked alone in locked rooms. The university's counseling services provided temporary relief, but I couldn't explain the full scope of my concerns without sounding delusional. The final photograph appeared on a humid evening in late spring, posted to an account that used my own name as its handle. The image showed me sitting at my desk, working on my laptop, taken from inside my apartment, from an angle that suggested the photographer had been standing directly behind my chair. But I'd been alone that evening, doors locked, blinds closed, working in the isolation I'd cultivated as protection against external observation. The metadata revealed no useful information, timestamps that might have been accurate or completely fabricated, geolocation data that pointed to coordinates in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. But the image itself was undeniably real, showing details of my living space that no one else should have been able to document. I'm writing this account now with the certainty that he's still watching, still documenting, still existing in the spaces between reality and performance, where truth becomes indistinguishable from elaborate fiction. The rational explanations I once clung to have dissolved under the weight of accumulated impossibility, leaving me suspended in a world where observation and paranoia have merged into something beyond my ability to comprehend or control. The music continues, drifting from locations that exist only when no one is looking directly at them, played by someone whose identity shifts like sand in wind. Whether he's real or imaginary, criminal or supernatural, performer or predator, no longer seems like a question that can be answered within the framework of ordinary experience. Sometimes I wonder if I'm the performance now, my growing paranoia and social isolation serving as entertainment for an audience I'll never see. The boundary between observer and observed has become so thoroughly blurred that I can no longer determine which side of the lens I occupy, or whether the distinction has any meaning in a world where reality itself has become negotiable. The photographs still appear, documenting a life I'm no longer certain I'm actually living. And somewhere in the spaces between digital and physical, between performance and truth, between sanity and whatever lies beyond it, the music plays on, marking time in a reality that refuses to hold still long enough to be properly understood. Story 14. The oil in the cast iron pan hissed and popped as I dropped the diced onions in, their sharp scent cutting through the stale air of the rental house. The television chattered in the background, some ancient children's program I'd stumbled across while channel surfing, its cheerful music and synthetic voices creating a comforting bubble of noise in the too-quiet house on Cascade Road. I hadn't bothered changing the channel. The familiar cadence of scripted enthusiasm helped fill the hollow spaces that seemed to expand every evening after work. The show's host, a woman with an unnaturally bright smile and voice like spun sugar, addressed her invisible audience with the kind of forced cheer that made my skin crawl. But it was background noise, nothing more. I stirred the onions and reached for the bell peppers, already planning my solitary dinner and the blessed numbness of sleep that would follow. "What's your name?" the television asked, as it must have asked thousands of times in countless living rooms across America. From somewhere behind me, from the direction of the hallway that led to the bedrooms, came a voice. Clear, feminine, and undeniably real. "You know mine." The wooden spoon clattered against the stove as my hand jerked involuntarily. I stood frozen, listening to the sudden silence that seemed to press against my eardrums like cotton. Even the sizzling of the onions had quieted to nothing. My throat felt dry as old paper as I turned off the burner and walked slowly toward the living room, each footstep on the hardwood floor sounding like a gunshot in the stillness. The television continued its cheerful programming, oblivious to the ice that had settled in my chest. I scanned the empty hallway, noting the way the shadows seemed deeper than usual, more defined. The rental house had always felt temporary, like a stage set waiting to be struck, but now it felt occupied in a way that made my scalp prickle with unease. I told myself it was the neighbor's television bleeding through the thin walls, or perhaps a delayed echo from my own set. These old Atlanta houses were full of acoustic quirks, their walls thin enough to share whispers between strangers. But the voice had been close, intimate, as if someone had been standing just behind my shoulder while I cooked. The living room appeared exactly as I'd left it. The worn couch with its faded floral pattern, the coffee table stacked with unread mail, the chandelier hanging crooked from the water-damaged ceiling. But something was wrong with the light. The room seemed dimmer than usual, and as my eyes adjusted, I noticed that one of the bulbs from the 5-bulb fixture was missing. Not burned out. Missing. I found it on the coffee table, placed with deliberate care in the exact center, its metal threads still warm to the touch. The bulb sat there like an offering, or a message, perfectly positioned as if someone had taken great care in its placement. I picked it up, turning it over in my palm, feeling the weight of it, the impossibility of it. The chandelier hung 8 feet above the table. Even standing on the couch, I would need a ladder to reach it. My mouth tasted of copper pennies as I screwed the bulb back into its socket, my hands shaking slightly as I climbed onto the couch cushions. The light flickered once before settling into a steady glow that seemed to make the shadows in the room shift and writhe at the edges of my vision. That night, I lay in bed listening to the house breathe around me. Every creak of settling wood, every sigh of wind through the eaves, seemed amplified and deliberate. The rental agreement had mentioned the house's age. Built in 1954, it had housed dozens of tenants over the decades. I wondered about them as I stared at the water stain on the bedroom ceiling that looked like a face in the dim light filtering through the curtains. The sleep that finally came was fitful and broken, full of half-remembered dreams where voices whispered just beyond the range of understanding. Morning brought no relief. I found my scarf, the blue wool one I'd hung on the hook by the front door, tied in an elaborate knot and draped over the back of the kitchen chair. The knot was complex, nautical in its precision, with loops and twists that spoke of knowledge I didn't possess. I'd never been in the Navy, had never learned to tie anything more complicated than my shoelaces. Yet here was this perfectly executed sailor's knot in my own scarf. I took photographs with my phone, documenting the strange intricacy of the thing before untying it with clumsy fingers that seemed to forget their usual dexterity. The scarf came free eventually, but the memory of those precise loops lingered in my mind like a splinter. Work provided temporary escape from the mounting unease, but even there, in the sterile environment of the office, I found myself jumping at shadows, turning at the sound of footsteps that belonged to no one. My colleagues began to give me worried looks, asking if I was feeling well, if I was getting enough sleep. I made excuses about adjusting to the new place, about the stress of the recent move to Atlanta, but their concern only added to the growing paranoia that seemed to follow me like a persistent echo. The house welcomed me back each evening with its familiar emptiness, but the emptiness itself had taken on a quality of expectancy, as if the rooms were holding their breath. I began to notice things, small displacements that could have been explained away by forgetfulness or fatigue, but which accumulated like drops of water wearing away stone. A book I'd left on the kitchen counter appeared on the bathroom sink. The television remote, which I always placed on the coffee table, turned up wedged between the couch cushions. My coffee mug, washed and dried the night before, sat in the sink with a thin film of condensation inside, as if someone had drunk from it and rinsed it clean. But it was the silence that bothered me most. The house had been quiet when I'd first moved in, peaceful in its solitude. Now the silence felt pregnant with presence, thick with unspoken words and barely contained breath. I found myself turning up the television louder each night, desperate to fill the spaces where something seemed to be listening. The third incident happened on a Thursday evening as autumn rain drummed against the windows. I'd been reading in the living room when I heard what sounded like footsteps in the hallway, slow, deliberate, and unmistakably real. My book fell from nerveless fingers as I sat perfectly still, straining to hear past the rain's percussion. The footsteps stopped directly outside the living room entrance. I could feel a presence there, patient and watchful, separated from me by nothing more than air and intention. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees, and I found myself shivering despite the sweater I wore. Minutes passed like hours before I finally worked up the courage to investigate. The hallway stretched empty and silent, but the hardwood floor was marked with wet footprints. Bare feet, delicate and feminine, leading from the bathroom to where I'd heard the presence stop. The prints were fresh, still glistening in the overhead light, but they led nowhere. They simply ended, as if their maker had dissolved into the charged air of the house. I followed the trail backward to the bathroom, where I found the medicine cabinet standing open, its mirror reflecting an empty room. Inside, my toiletries had been rearranged with the same deliberate care that had marked the placement of the light bulb. My razor, toothbrush, and prescription bottles were lined up in perfect symmetry, labels facing forward like products in a pharmacy display. Sleep became elusive. I lay in bed each night, listening to the subtle sounds of occupancy that had no source. The soft closing of doors, the whisper of fabric against skin, the barely audible hum of someone moving through rooms I could not see. My eyes grew hollow with exhaustion, and my hands developed a fine tremor that I couldn't quite control. The rational part of my mind offered explanations. Stress, isolation, the natural tendency of the human brain to find patterns in randomness. Perhaps I was moving things myself and forgetting, acting out some subconscious drama of displacement and loneliness. The alternative, that I was sharing my temporary home with something that defied explanation, seemed too impossible to entertain seriously. But impossibility is a fragile thing, easily shattered by persistent evidence. On the 7th night since the voice had first answered the television, I woke to find my bedroom door standing open. I always closed it before sleep, a habit born of years of living alone, yet there it stood, revealing the dark hallway beyond, like a mouth preparing to speak. The air that drifted through the opening was cold, and carried with it a scent I couldn't identify, something floral and old-fashioned, like perfume that had been stored in a drawer for decades. I rose from bed on unsteady legs and approached the doorway with the caution of prey sensing a predator. The hallway stretched before me in shades of gray and black, empty yet somehow full of watching presence. My bare feet found the cool hardwood, and I stepped into the corridor with a mixture of terror and desperate curiosity. The house felt different at night, older somehow, as if the darkness had stripped away the veneer of the familiar and revealed something more fundamental underneath. I could hear my own heartbeat echoing in my ears as I moved toward the living room, drawn by an impulse I couldn't name. She was there, not visible, not precisely, but present in a way that made the hair on my arms stand electric and my breath catch in my throat. The living room felt crowded with her existence, thick with the weight of attention focused entirely on me. I could sense her shape in the negative space, the way the shadows fell differently around where she might be standing, the subtle displacement of air that spoke of a form both there and not there. The television flickered to life without anyone touching the remote. The same children's program filled the screen, though at this hour it should have been nothing but static or test patterns. The host's cheerful voice filled the room with its synthetic warmth, asking questions of an audience that existed only in the space between transmission and reception. "What brings you joy?" the television asked, and I felt rather than heard the answer that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards beneath my feet. "You do." My voice cracked as I finally found the courage to speak aloud, addressing the presence that filled the room like held breath. I told her, whatever shared my space, that I would be leaving soon, that the lease was month to month and I had no intention of staying past the holidays. The words tumbled out in a rush, explanations and apologies directed at an entity I couldn't see and wasn't certain existed outside my own unraveling sanity. The television went dark with a soft click, as if invisible fingers had found the power button. In the sudden silence, I felt the presence shift and settle, like a cat curling up in a sunny patch of floor. There was something almost satisfied in the quality of the attention that remained focused on me, the feeling of having been heard and understood in ways that language couldn't quite capture. I returned to bed, but didn't sleep. Instead, I lay staring at the ceiling, feeling the house breathe around me with a rhythm that wasn't quite my own. The presence that had filled the living room seemed to disperse gradually, settling into the walls and floorboards like smoke being absorbed by fabric. Dawn brought no revelations, no dramatic resolution to the questions that had taken root in my mind like invasive plants. I packed methodically over the following days, each item wrapped and stored with the careful attention of someone trying not to disturb a sleeping animal. The house remained quiet during this process, almost cooperative, as if whatever inhabited its spaces understood that my tenancy was drawing to a close. On my last morning, as I loaded the final boxes into my car, I found one last message waiting for me. On the kitchen counter, spelled out in letters cut from newspaper and magazines with the precision of a ransom note, were the words, "Thank you for staying." I left the letters where I found them, a small offering to whatever had shared those weeks with me. The drive away from Cascade Road felt like awakening from a dream, or perhaps like falling asleep into one. The rational world reasserted itself with each mile that passed, offering comfortable explanations for what couldn't be comfortably explained. But sometimes, in the quiet moments between sleep and waking, I find myself wondering about the house and its patient occupant. I wonder if she's still there, waiting for the next temporary tenant to provide brief company in her endless residence. I wonder if the voice I heard was born from loneliness, mine or hers, and whether the distinction matters in the end. The new apartment is bright and modern, filled with the sounds of living neighbors and traffic. There are no unexplained voices here, no mysteriously rearranged objects or impossible knots tied in familiar things. It should feel like relief, this return to the explainable world. Instead, it feels like exile from a truth too strange to name but too persistent to forget entirely. Some nights, when the silence grows too complete, I find myself almost missing the weight of that watchful attention, the knowledge that somewhere in the shadows, something was listening with the intensity of perfect understanding. The question that haunts me isn't whether she was real. Reality, I've learned, is more fluid than we like to believe. The question is whether I was the ghost in her story, a temporary disruption in the long, patient existence of something that had found its home in the spaces between explanation and acceptance. I keep the photographs of the sailor's knot on my phone, sometimes studying them in quiet moments, tracing the pattern of loops and twists that my hands could never have created. They remind me that some mysteries are meant to be experienced rather than solved, and that the boundary between the possible and impossible is thinner than we imagine, as thin as the voice that answers when we think we're alone, as delicate as the touch that rearranges our familiar world while we sleep. The house on Cascade Road stands waiting, patient as stone and twice as lasting. And sometimes, just sometimes, I think I can still hear her voice carried on the wind, not calling my name, but simply acknowledging that names, like explanations, are far less important than the recognition that passes between two forms of existence when they briefly share the same small space in an infinite and inexplicable universe.